Chapter 486. Lu Xiaoyi started to roast the lamb. The fastest way for a cultivator to cook was to use fire techniques. However, one had to pay attention to the taste of food. If one did not want convenience, it would be best to roast it slowly. For example, in this situation, one should roast it slowly with ordinary fire and brush it with seasoning before drinking it slowly. Only then would it be interesting. As soon as he lit the fire, the two golden core cultivators shook their heads. His fire elemental techniques were terrible, and he was so stupid to light firewood. Presumably, he wouldn't be able to control the fire when roasting. A good sheep would be ruined by him. Yi was very impatient. Go, 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 let me do it. It was his own lamb, and he had to serve it himself. He did not know how he got to this position. As he roasted the lamb, he asked, "What do you want to ask me?" Lu Xiaoyi said seriously. "First, the defense of external swords. Second, the essentials of core formation. Please don't mind my presumptuousness." Yi nodded. He was very satisfied that Lu Xiaoyi came to Weijian Mountain to ask these questions. This meant that he did not treat him as an outsider here. Although he had tricked Xianyuan into joining him, he would never be able to change Xuanyuan's position in his heart. However, it was still a blessing for him to have such a good swordsman to be able to help him grow. Talking about the future, this Lu Xiaoyi was very much to his liking. The key was that his strength and potential were limitless. He was worth a lot of effort to nurture. What presumptuousness! Don't say such hypocritical words in Weijian Mountain in the future. If you really think it's presumptuousness, you shouldn't have come. You have to remember that you have a name in the sword book of Weijian Mountain. You are a member of my Weijian Mountain. In the future, I will not say it's presumptuousness when I use you. You don't have to feel embarrassed when you come here to cheat for food, drink, skills, and insights. Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly. Martial uncle, how can this be called cheating? Yi ignored him and said, I have some insights about the defense of external swords. In the sword vein, let's not talk about internal swords. That is not the same path as us. Let's just talk about your Qianqiu Peak. The concept of swordsmanship is not as good as Weijian Mountain. For a swordsman, defense shouldn't be their first priority. This is our principle. Replacing defense with offense is our core principle. Making the opponent unable to attack and perform improperly is always the first choice. You are known as the first heavy sword and the first long-range sword in Fish Leap. I think you know this very well. I don't need to say more. Yi continued as he spun the sheep and harvested the materials. But there will always be accidents, exceptions, and inconveniences. In battle, under special circumstances, when you can't use offense to replace defense, we need to have our own methods. Nothing is absolute. Cultivation is a kind of balance. Being too extreme is not in line with the path of cultivation. Therefore, even my Wei Sword Mountain has to be defended. In terms of defense alone, there are 3 strategies: top, middle, and bottom. He took a sip of wine and watched as Lu Xiaoyi listened attentively. Only then did he explain. The worst plan is the best. Even among the swordsmen, there were many who had learned defensive techniques with mana meridians. They mainly relied on talismans, and with the combination of speed, they were able to escape from a temporary predicament and look for an opportunity to counterattack. This was a temporary measure. If the sword was wrong, the sword technique would be wrong, and in the end, nothing would be accomplished. It was just a temporary measure for a new foundation establishment cultivator. The middle plan was the sword. No matter if it was Wei Sword Mountain or your Xianyuan, there were many defensive sword techniques that could be learned. However, the path of the sword was mainly for offense. Using the sword to defend would result in twice the effort for half the result. The best plan was the sword formation. This was also what I wanted to recommend to you. I noticed that your mental strength is different from ordinary people. You have the basic ability to control a sword formation. Therefore, you can find some basic sword formations to learn and improve your defense. Sword formation? This was a direction that Lu Xiaoyi had not thought of at all. It was also a new direction for him. Yi reminded. Don't be greedy for more. I know that you are of the constellation system. You can't wait to learn the heavenly psycho-constellation sword technique and create the hardest turtle shell. For beginner sword formations, start from the simplest. From there, you can grasp the balance and cooperation between the flying swords, the concept of the sword formation, and the coordination of offense and defense. Wei Sword Mountain had many of these beginner sword formations. For example, the yin-yang sword wall, the 3 talents sword formation with 3 flying swords, the 3 primordial sword chi formation, and so on. When you have completely grasped the basic concept of the sword formation, you can then look for the most suitable sword formation for yourself. For example, the Big Dipper formation. However, there is no Big Dipper formation in Wei Sword Mountain. Our sword formation is more simple, unlike Xian Yuan who wanted to steal everything from their mana meridians. Sword formations were like juggling balls and rings. One had to start with 2 balls and gradually increase the number of balls after mastering them. If you start with 7 balls and 10 rings, you can imagine the efficiency. Ordinary people relied on the dexterity of their hands to control the balls and rings. Cultivators relied entirely on their spirit and had a high requirement on their mental strength. After all, the burden of controlling 1 flying sword and 7 flying swords was completely different. Therefore, in the sword vein, there were very few swordsmen who practiced sword formations. They usually started with Jing Dan, and only at the Yuanying stage could they fully unleash the power of the sword formation. To Lu Xiaoyi, this was a very good direction. In fact, his mental strength was different from ordinary people. However, he was often unable to unleash his advantage in battle. The range of his sword was too far and there were very few opportunities for him to use his mental strength to shock others. Furthermore, with the help of the sword spirits, his mental strength consumption was also much lower than other swordsmen. Although he had a strong mental strength, he was unable to unleash it in battle. This had always bothered him. Now, he finally had a suitable direction. The old swordsman was much stronger than him in this aspect. Just like what Yingyi said, he could first learn the sword formation formed by 2 or 3 flying swords in Weijian Mountain. After he had mastered it, he could then return to the Dome Peak to learn the Big Dipper sword formation. He just so happened to have 7 sword spirits. His train of thought was very clear. Based on the number of sword spirits he had now, he was afraid that he would rarely use a sword formation like the Big Dipper sword formation which required 7 flying swords. In most of his battles, he would use 4 or 3 flying swords to attack and 3 or 4 flying swords to defend. Then, the most practical sword formation would be the ordinary 4 elements sword formation. Yingyi saw that he was thinking by himself and ignored him. He began to eat meat and drink wine with Wang Ding. There were very few people who practiced sword formations in Weijian Mountain, so there was no need to force it. However, this little guy was different. He was already standing at this position. He was not an ordinary person and could not be measured by ordinary people's thinking. After a while, seeing that this little guy seemed to have thought it through and began to eat meat and drink wine, Yingyi could not help but feel depressed again. He had to teach him swordsmanship and feed him. He even had to know his feelings because he was the one who brought the sheep here. Did he steal a father? He snorted. I will only teach you swordsmanship. As for forming the core, senior brother Wang Ding is the true expert. He formed a high-grade core. He has a lot of experience in this area and his theories are unique. If you serve him well, he will leave a few words for you. You will benefit from it for the rest of your life. Lu Xiaoyi stood up respectfully. This disciple salutes martial uncle. There is plenty of wine. Little Yi will accompany you with his life. Yingyi took a deep breath. The special wine was also his. Chapter 487. Wang Ding was also amused. Your martial uncle doesn't have any other hobbies except for the red cliff goats in this mine. The cliff goats near your martial uncle Yingye's residence are especially tender. Go get a few more when you have time. I won't hide anything about the mysteries of core formation. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Don't worry, uncle. As long as I am in Weijian Mountain, I will come here often. If there are any cliff sheep, they will not be able to escape from me. Wang Ding smiled and said seriously, The Jin Dan of Taoism uses the human body as a cauldron, using the essence and qi in the body as medicine. Using the spirit to refine the essence, qi, and spirit, they can condense to form a sacred fetus and be reborn. The Taoist scripture Big Cave Scripture says, Cave source and enlightenment, all Taoists are born from the same source. The heart wants to move but the spirit doesn't stop. The body wants to move but the consciousness doesn't separate. The soul wants to come out but the spirit doesn't molt. These are the precursors to the formation of the aurous core. At the beginning, the qi is connected. At the second, the spirit is connected. At the end, the spirit is connected. At the end, the spirit is connected. The Xiaoyao technique passed down by the ancestors only teaches to concentrate the spirit into the core point. Those who concentrate the spirit will receive the thoughts into the heart. This heart is not the heart of flesh and blood, but the heart of the middle palace. It is located below the Jiangong, above the Shinkei, behind the Zhongwan, before the spine. It is in the middle of the human body. It is not a point, but a circle of nothingness. It is as big as the universe and as small as a mustard seed. It has a shape and a strong name is the Huangting. It can turn thoughts, lock delusions, give birth to wisdom and summon spirits. When it is still, the primordial spirit will appear. When it is moved, the true intention will be received and received. Wang Ding had the temperament of an old pedant. His words were very detailed and vague, but his theoretical level was solid. Lu Xiaoyi had heard and read these words countless times in the dome, but he was still focused and did not become absent-minded just because he was tired of listening to it. Taoist Wang Ding was very satisfied with such an attitude under his silent observation. Only then did he start to talk about the real things. Everyone was different. Lu Xiaoyi and Yin Yi were friends despite the difference in age, but he was not. Cultivators were very clear about this. Since he wanted to ask for guidance, and was a disciple of Weijian Mountain, he would not hide anything. However, there was a difference in how he taught. If you don't have the slightest bit of patience, you will naturally teach without thinking. If you don't understand, go back and think about it yourself. If your attitude is proper and you have a heart that seeks the Tao, then it will be a different kind of teaching method. Teaching and educating people also depends on the target. This nonsense was Taoist Wang Ding's way of judging whether a disciple could be taught or not. It was simple and effective. The heavens have 33 layers, and the core has 3 colors. Golden light illuminates the world, purple qi enshrouds the world, colorless and infinite. That's what the inheritance says, and theoretically it's also incomparably correct. But what I want to tell you is that when it comes to actually implementing it, it's useless. There were countless descriptions of Jin Dan in the cultivation world. Although they sounded convincing, in reality, there were countless accidents during the core formation stage. It was simply not a controllable process. It's not something that you can decide by swallowing some miraculous pills, meeting some coincidences, and accumulating countless resources. What core formation? From the moment you enter the Tao, in your long foundation establishment career, you have already formed your own path step by step. The direction of your skills, the way you handle things, your own potential, the changes in your state of mind, etc. Many aspects have already determined what kind of core you will form. It's not something that can be formed just by slapping your forehead and saying that this core is good and that core rod is good. Lu Xiaoyi nodded his head. This was something that wasn't written in books, but you couldn't say that what was written in a book was wrong. This was the subtlety of Taoism. So, no matter if it's your Xian Yuan, our Weijian Mountain, or the Supreme Three Pure Ones, they all have ancient inheritances. They never force their disciples to cultivate in a certain direction. Instead, they focus on free-range cultivation. They would rather bear a large number of disciples who would destroy their own resources in the process of free-range cultivation. They want to cultivate a group of disciples who have truly found their own direction, because only this group of people are the true seeds of Jin Dan. This is a very complicated process. Other than yourself, no one can help you. Your specialties, your hobbies, your potential, your temperament, your nature. When you have sorted out these things and persevered for hundreds of years, then you will naturally have a great path to Jean Dan. Then you can supplement it with some other methods, resources, opportunities, epiphanies, pills, external objects. These are all supplements, but they are not the decisive power. If you don't walk the right path, you won't be able to eat anything. Then, do you feel that you have always been walking your own path and have never given up? Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while, then nodded his head firmly. I believe that I have never changed. Wang Ding laughed loudly. At least, this little guy had no problem with confidence. Meat, come! Wine, come! Junior brother Yin Yi, your meat can't keep up. Yin Yi was a little depressed. Could it be that he, the great Jean Dan, had now become an errand boy? Wang Ding took a mouthful of meat and wine, and was in the mood to chat. Dividing pills into 3 grades is actually a general concept. Every orthodoxy is different. Don't look at how everyone is in the 5th ring now. 20,000 years ago, they all had their own star domains. For example, our Weijian Mountain is in the new Guangqing domain, Xianyuan is in the Azure Sky Great World, Supreme is in the new Ding domain, Garan is in the Transmission Upper domain. Therefore, the division of pills into different grades is also different. Some are divided into 9 transformations, some are divided into 3 grades, some are divided into 5 elements, some are divided into 7 colors, and so on. It's a mess. How can there be a conclusion? The biggest taboo in forming one's core is to divide one's own grades. If you feel that you have a chance to achieve a high grade, you will start acting rashly. If you feel that it's not ideal, you will not be satisfied. If you are so worried about personal gains and losses, how can you have a normal mentality? If you can't even have a proper mentality when forming your core, how can you form your core? Therefore, let nature take its course. When the conditions are right, success will come naturally. Your 100 years of cultivation will determine what kind of core you form. As for whether it's good or bad, why think so much? If the grade is too high, the heavens might not like it and strike you with lightning. Just think about it and live a few hundred more years. That's enough. As for the future, take it one step at a time. Do you think that I'm too negative in advising people to form their core like this? Lu Xiaoyi said seriously. Martial uncle, I understand what you mean. I won't force it. Don't want to become the highest grade of 5-ring Jean Dan in this generation just because you took first place at Fish Leap Sword Insertion. There's actually no relationship between the two. Wang Ding was very gratified. You're worth teaching. That's what I mean. How can there be first place in the cultivation world? Even with your current combat ability, you might not be first. Let me tell you, don't think that the heavenly Tao is usually invisible and untouchable. It actually has eyes. Are you willing to stand at the highest point and be scrutinized by the heavenly Tao, or hide in the crowd and bide your time? Deep emotions don't last long, wisdom changes the heavens, invincibility is hard to advance. Cultivation is about balance. It's just that the balance in everyone's eyes is different. What's mine might not be yours. You can only figure out these things yourself. No one can help you. Throughout the entire discussion, Wang Ding did not touch on any specific methods of forming one's core. This was something that only responsible elders would do. How could there be an identical method of forming one's core in this world? Chapter 488. P.S. Recently, the discussion section has been a little heated. Regarding the choice of inserting the sword, Sloth has to say that it is completely unnecessary. Sloth doesn't want to impose anything on you, so please don't impose anything on Sloth, okay? Leaving the group, watching pirated versions, voting next door, etc. This is not how adults express themselves. Let me remind you that there are people who set the pace. Whether you leave or stay, as long as it is your choice, it doesn't matter. But if you are taken away by others, it will be too sad. The cultivation world is very dirty, and so are other places. You have to keep your eyes open. In addition, please subscribe to my collection. Although my writing is average, I am thick-skinned. I hope that my friends who like it can support me. My days are not easy. Some of my friends are unhappy and have left. Will there be new people coming in? By the way, Sloth will not change his writing style. He is old, but he is unrepentant. No choice. Lu Xiaoyi stayed at Yinye's place. It was very interesting to listen to them talk about the cultivation world. Yinye still focused his attention on the subordinate planets around the fifth ring. He was a person who yearned to live in the void of the universe, but he couldn't go because of his realm, so he focused on these subordinate planets. In fact, what he pursued was whether there were any opportunities for him to fight wantonly on these subordinate planets. Wei Jianshan was a little depressed in her eye. It was okay for him to build his foundation, as he had a chance to test his skills and wouldn't cause any trouble. But the competition between Jing Dan needed to be careful. If he didn't fight, he would feel aggrieved. If he fought, he had to consider whether it would bring any trouble to the sect. The three pure ones were here. This was a hurdle that couldn't be avoided. It was also impossible to do things based on one's mood. The stage of the real people was in the void of the universe. In the fifth ring, the Jin Dan was the pillar and couldn't be messed around. Wang Ding was speechless towards this junior brother. Go to the subordinate planets to fight? Only you can think of that. How many people could such a small celestial body contain? And most of them are barren dead stars. With our realm, we can't survive there. Over the past 20,000 years, a total of 100 subordinate stars had been captured. Most of them were the so-called dead stars without an atmosphere, so naturally, there was no spiritium to speak of. There were only 20 or so celestial bodies with a gas layer, but most of them had environments that were not suitable for human habitation. They were abruptly hot and cold, and the temperature difference between high and low was extremely great. There were less than 10 planets with an atmosphere that was suitable for human survival. Only 3 of them had spiritium, and they were all at the level of beginner cultivation spiritium. Such a situation was actually in line with the reality of the countless planets in the universe. Cultivation starfields were hard to find, and high-grade starfields were even harder to find. The result of 20,000 years of exploration was a detailed representation of the stars in the universe. There were also minerals, but they were not precious. If they were placed in the fifth ring, they would be worth mining, but if they were placed in the subordinate planets, they would be worthless. Just the transportation costs alone would be unbearable, so there was basically no need to talk about developing them. Among all the subordinate planets, not a single one was inhabited by humans. But on most of the subordinate planets with a gas layer, there were indeed living creatures, but they were all at the beginner stage of living creatures. There was no spiritium, so of course, there were no big monsters. This was a common phenomenon in the universe. Yinye was very regretful. With the Five-Ring Alliance's strategy, the subordinate planets were not distributed to the various powers under the alliance, so there would be less conflict. If you asked me, they should be distributed and let us Jin Dan level people practice on them. Anyway, it wouldn't hurt to destroy those places. And train the body. Senior brother, I haven't really fought with anyone in 30 years. What's the use of learning sword skills? Wang Ding snorted. Junior brother, I have to say, you're too narrow-minded. How can you only focus on fighting all day? Protecting the fifth ring, maintaining peace in Irai, the development of the sword vein, and the cultivation of disciples are what you really need to focus on. Lu Xiaoyi sat with the 2 Jing Dan for another day. Seeing that the 2 of them were still chatting happily, he knew that this gathering would not end in a few days. He was worried about the sword array, so he bid farewell to the 2 elders. Yinye was very careful. Wei Sword Mountain is your home. Don't treat me as an outsider. You can use the sword talisman to get the same treatment as others. But this is not your home. Don't come to my place in the future. Every time I see you, I'll be at a disadvantage. Lu Xiaoyi had already understood the story of the sheep, so he smiled and said, No, this is also my home. Next time, I'll bring the sheep over. Martial uncle, I have a small matter that I need your help with. Yin was very vigilant. Say it. But don't talk about the matter of using spirit stones. Your martial uncle is also very poor now. Lu Xiai smiled. I don't want to use spirit stones. Martial uncle, look at my current situation. I really want to find a quiet place, so it's not good for me to be involved too much. In a few days, Lan Chong and the others will come back. At that time, I can't avoid a period of eating and stuffing. See if you can think of a way to hide me, including the people at the dome. If they know that I'm here, they'll definitely arrest me and interrogate me thoroughly. It's really troublesome. Yin Yi shook his head. You're not a young lady, why are you afraid of meeting people? These troubles are also part of cultivation. Deal with them yourself. I can't help you. Wang Ding, who was behind him, opened his mouth and said, Wait a minute. I have a small item here that can cover you up a little. However, you shouldn't touch it casually. There's no perfect way to cover something like this. Seeing Lu Xue leave, Yin was very puzzled. Senior martial brother? Wang Ding sighed. Metal is the complete nature, Dan is the circle of life. The union of life and death is called Jing Dan. This child already has signs of forming his gold core, but it's hard to say whether he can walk out of it in the end. He should have a quiet environment. Yin Yi was a little lacking in this aspect. He had a personality that liked to raise his sword and slash people. His grasp of his disciples' cultivation state was not as deep as Wang Ding's. But he still thought that it was a little hasty. The state that Wang Ding mentioned about cultivators could be achieved by many outstanding foundation establishment disciples. This meant that the cultivator had more or less met the basic requirements to form his gold core, but it was hard to say how to take the final step. It could be right now, or it could be decades or centuries later. There was no fixed number. Most people would choose to travel to relax their state of mind and be more sensitive to the will of the heavens. There were also people who sought breakthroughs in dangerous battles. Of course, there were also people who went into seclusion. There was no definite conclusion. You could do whatever you felt was suitable. In short, it was fine as long as it suited your heart. This disciple was different from others. He had too much karma on his body. If he really went out to travel, it was hard to say whether he could come back. But a swordsman could not be afraid because of this. If he didn't go out because he was afraid of danger, he wouldn't have a future. That was why Yin Yi rejected him. He was afraid that as a swordsman, he would lose the sharpness of a swordsman. No matter how dangerous it was, he couldn't hide and avoid it. But senior martial brother Wang Ding supported him. It seemed that he saw something that Yin Yi didn't. In terms of nurturing disciples to form their gold core, he was too far behind senior martial brother. But he could do something in other aspects. For example, he could communicate with the domed Qianxiu Peak. After thinking for a while, he recorded a message with his divine sense, Xianyuan cigarette but Weijian Mountain's Fei Chai, in order to avoid any accidents along the way, has arrived at Weijian Mountain recently. It's the eve of forming his gold core. He has requested to cultivate in peace and be indifferent to the outside world. Weijian Mountain has agreed. I hereby notify you. There were 3 layers of meaning in these words. First, he was in Weijian Mountain and was safe. Second, because he didn't want to provoke possible revenge along the way, he chose the closer Weijian Mountain. This was to give face to Xianyuan. Yin Yi also felt that the relationship between this disciple and Xianyuan was a bit strange. Although he was happy to see this happen, this was a red line that he couldn't touch. Third, Weijian Mountain had already agreed to his request. In other words, your Qianxiu Peak's sword Shi rushing heaven pavilion shouldn't casually interfere. This message, he still needed to get the approval of the higher-ups. It wasn't something that he could decide on his own. Of course, he also knew that this was just a formality. How serious could the problem of a foundation establishment cultivator be? Chapter 489. What Wang Ding prepared for Lu Xiaoyi was a straw hat, The straw hat could block the detection of divine sense. It was an honorable way of concealing oneself. It was very common in the cultivation world because there were too many situations where cultivators did not want their whereabouts to be exposed. Therefore, the meaning of wearing it was, "Please do not disturb." This was better than complete concealment. At least it showed selflessness instead of being sneaky. It was easier to accept. Lu Xiaoyu wore it and went to the Wei Sword Mountain's martial arts collection. He picked a few sword formations for himself. Of course, he could not hide it from the records of the disciples on duty. Cultivators were tactful. Considering his current situation and his current attire, the disciples on duty would not spread the news. They were all smart people. He only picked 2 sword formations, the yin-yang spectroscopic sword and the Sanyuan sword aura. These were the basics. He could learn the difference between an odd number sword formation and an even number sword formation. As for the sword formations with 4 to 6 flying swords in the future, there was no need for them. It was the basic ability of a cultivator to draw inferences about other sword formations from 1 to 10,000. Otherwise, he would be exhausted to death if he learned the heavenly cycle sword formation in the future. When he returned to his residence, he gathered the little ones, Big Mao, Second Mao, Third Mao, all the way to Mao Qi. Every sword spirit had to learn the sword formation. In theory, even if they did not learn it, Lu Xiaoyu could use his spiritual energy to control them. However, this would be very tiring. This was also the reason why the sword formation could not be popularized to the foundation establishment stage. If the sword spirits mastered the operating mechanism of the sword formation, coupled with Lu Xiaoyu's spiritual energy, the power that could be exerted would not be as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. Every sword spirit had to learn it because Lu Xiaoyu did not know which flying swords would be used to form the defensive sword formation in battle. Of course, he would focus on the attack first. When facing different opponents, which flying swords to use to attack, this was the first thing to consider. Secondly, the remaining flying swords to form the sword formation. However, after a little understanding of the yin-yang spectroscopic sword, he realized that the swordsman did not have a purely defensive sword formation. In terms of the yin-yang spectroscopic sword, there were thousands of changes in it. More than half of it taught people how to attack. This was a pleasant surprise. Because a very important method of attacking a sword formation was to gather the power of all the flying swords in the sword formation and add it to a single flying sword to carry out a focused attack. This was tantamount to giving him another way to increase the power of his flying sword. After going around in circles, he had returned to his original intention. This was the swordsman's skill. The attack had already seeped into his bones. The 7 flying swords flew out together, forming a sword formation in the sky. This was only one aspect. This was the cultivation method of an ordinary cultivator, but he was different. In Bolong Slope, under his command, 4 seasons and Zhu Qing led their little brothers to form a sword formation and surf. This was another way to speed up the growth of a sword spirit. With the help of other sword spirits, the weaker sword spirits would grow faster. Lu Xiaoyu was very particular about the combination of sword spirits. He tried his best to pair sword spirits with similar strength. If he used the strongest 4 seasons to help the weakest navy, it would be meaningless. If he rushed too quickly, it would hurt the navy. Therefore, 4 seasons with hidden fragrance, Zhu Qing with Big Dipper, and the weakest, Wu Xun with the navy. This combination was not fixed, and after a few days of practice, it would be broken up again. In any case, they were all spectroscopic, so there was no need to worry about them mixing it up. Luck Cutter was more special. Its strength was only related to the strength of the luck in his sea of consciousness. It was useless to surf in Bolong Slope. At this time, Lu Xiaoyu discovered that his so-called Big Dipper 7 stars formation seemed to be lacking a sword spirit. Because his Wu Xun was a parasitic sword spirit, it did not have a flying sword. He could only leave it for the future. This kind of day was indeed very dull, but after 10 years of competition, it was rare to have such a period of rest. Cultivation, 1 tension and 1 relaxation, this was the right way. Dome, Thousand Elegance Peak. The Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion's Jean Dan Hall masters were having another monthly meeting. All kinds of troublesome matters, like running accounts, made people sleepy. There were also many messy matters, but to them, who had long been used to it, it really did not arouse any interest. There were precedents, so they just had to follow them. But there was a topic that everyone knew, but no one was willing to mention it because it was too embarrassing. But things that should be discussed could not be avoided. After the other small troubles were dealt with, no one left, as if waiting for someone to speak first. The atmosphere was a bit strange. Ming Chuan Hall was the counterpart hall in charge of education among the tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators on Thousand Elegance Peak. So others could pretend to be deaf and dumb, but Ancient Mountain could not. Slowly. There is another small matter. Since no one is willing to speak, this old man will throw a brick to attract jade? A few days ago, there was news from Weijian Mountain. My Xianyuan Weijian disciple, Cigarette Butt, had stayed in Weijian Mountain to prepare to break through to the next realm. Well, this was not a big deal. With the relationship between the three sects of the Sword Alliance, it was normal for him to break through to the next realm. We went to Weijian Mountain's Firmament Sword sect. They came to Xianyuan not only to build their foundation, but also Jean Dan. As far as I know, there is one here. Haha, but this Cigarette Butt is a bit different. What is different, everyone knows, so I won't say more. Then this matter will be ignored, just like the other cultivators in history? Or will my Rushing Heaven Pavilion issue a decree to bring him back? I still need everyone to decide on the cause and effect. Although Gu Shan didn't explicitly state his position, the meaning behind his words was very clear. Among the halls of Thousand Elegance Peak, the Ascension Hall, the Inscription Hall, and the Dark Hall were all staunchly protective of their disciples. The other halls were also wearing the same pants as them, completely different from the other faction of Soaring Heaven Pavilion. This was also the strange thing about external swords. Sure enough, once Ancient Mountain spoke, Ancient Forest immediately jumped out. Agreed. Sword vein, sword vein. Isn't it the same no matter where he forms his core? Cigarette Butt was born in Xianyuan, and will always be a person of Xianyuan. This will not change no matter where he goes. What is there to discuss? Could it be that if he forms his core in Weijian Mountain, he will become a person of Weijian Mountain? Then if he forms his core in the wild, he will become a loose cultivator? Will he become a peacock when his peacock feather forms his core? The various hall masters laughed impudently. They were the true masters of the foundation building disciples and had a lot of contact with them. They also looked down on those in Rushing Heaven Pavilion who put on false pretenses. Either you wholeheartedly cultivated and did not care about anything, or you truly went down to the ground level to share trials and tribulations with the foundation building disciples. They were so high up in the air, yet they still came out to point fingers and talk about the sect's righteousness. These people were all old Jean Dan. They did not have any ties and were not afraid of offending people. However, among the true upper echelons of Xianyuan, they valued this group of people's generosity very much. Therefore, they laughed impudently. Gu Dong's face turned ashen. How could he not understand that these words were directed at them? These bastards did not have the slightest awareness of the big picture. He could not let the situation get out of control. He had to stand up. Therefore, he slammed the table. Others can. But this Cigarette Butt is different. He has too many secrets on him. It's not good for him to form his core outside, especially under that bastard Yin Yi. After a long time, he and his secrets will become a person of Weijian Mountain sooner or later. Gu Gang suddenly stood up and slammed the table as well, but his voice was even louder. The matter of Cigarette Butt, the masters have already come to a conclusion. Why is Senior Marshal Brother Gudong still looking into it endlessly? Who doesn't have some secrets? Cigarette Butt would rather cultivate in Weijian Mountain than return to the dome. It's all because of you bunch of people who have nothing better to do. Even now, you don't realize it, and push all the blame to your disciples. You never think about how you are a master. Chapter 490. Gu Gang was very angry. Since he had already spoken, he did not mind being impudent for once. As a teacher, you're always thinking about the good things of your disciples. Is this kind of sect still Xianyuan? You want to know everything. You want to know about the spirit of the flying sword. You want to know about the changes in the peacock plume. You also want to know why you were able to insert a sword into the fish leaping cliff for 10 years. Everything is for the sake of the sect. If you're like you, who can't tolerate special talents, those earth-shattering old ancestors of Xianyuan would not be able to grow. The sect would have already dissected their souls and bones and studied them thoroughly. Is there any meaning? What's his is his. If he gave it to you and gave it to other cultivators, they wouldn't be able to become cigarette butts. It's such a simple logic. You're still in the Rising Heaven Pavilion, but you're so obsessed with it. Gu Dong was furious. Gu Gang! Don't you dare slander me here. You're bringing official matters into private matters. I didn't say what to do with him. He's just a Foundation establishment senior brother, not a father. What, do I have to serve him? I can't even ask him? I want to know the secret of the sword spirit's birth. I want to help the external swords get rid of their useless status. What, is there anything wrong with that? I want to know what happened in the peacock plume. Only then can we reconcile our relationship with the Peacock Palace. This is the rule set by the old ancestor. It has been upheld for tens of thousands of years. What, even the old ancestor's rule is not good anymore? I want to know everything he did in the fish leaping cliff. How did he do it? It's also to improve the overall strength of the external sword lineage. Is this for me? There's nothing wrong with trusting a disciple. But if you don't even care about the rules, that's dereliction of duty. My Rising Heaven Pavilion will never allow it, Gu Lin said sarcastically at the side. Oh, senior brother Gu Dong is so righteous. What a good way to pull the banner. However, it's not your turn to be the head of the Rising Heaven Pavilion. If you really become the head, everyone will break up sooner or later. Everyone has their own secrets. The moon gathering once again entered the usual quarrel mode. Only when a dignified divine sense pressed down did everyone settle down under the might of a perfected person. I will communicate with Weijin Mountain about this matter. We have to take care of all aspects. You don't have to participate. I will say one more thing. The next time you quarrel, remember to get lost and quarrel outside. You have no self-restraint. Where do you think this is? Since Shinrin Yuanying had taken responsibility for this matter, the Jin Dan under him could do nothing about it. This was a characteristic of all bureaucratic systems. There had to be disagreements and factions at the grassroots level. Only then would the higher-ups be able to control the overall situation. The various halls did not have many opportunities to contact the Jinren, but it was much more convenient for the Jin Dan who cultivated in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. Although he was not clear about the Jinren's attitude, Gu Dong still found an excuse to privately ask for the higher-ups' opinions. Jinren Rui was also very depressed. He was a newcomer who had been transferred to the Rising Heaven Pavilion in recent years. The newcomer did not refer to Yuanying's cultivation, but to his experience in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. This perfected person had lived in the universe for a long time and was a very powerful cultivator. However, he was not familiar with these affairs. This was also the usual practice of Xianyuan. The lower halls were all old cultivators with limited potential. However, in the Thunder Hall and the Rising Heaven Pavilion, the real powerhouses took turns to be the head. The management of affairs was also a part of cultivation. They would not focus on it, but they had to understand it. Only then could they have a sense of the overall situation of Xianyuan. This was also to cultivate the vision of a great cultivator. Facing Gu Dong's question, the perfected person also had a headache. I have carefully investigated this person's past and found many strange things. It's not a matter of loyalty, but mainly a matter of cultivation. Regarding the cultivation of the sword spirit, the abnormality of the peacock plume, the creation of the fish leaping cliff. To be honest, This person's appearance has given my external sword sect a chance to turn things around for the first time in tens of thousands of years. If he can continue to grow, the rise of the external sword sect will be just around the corner. Such a person, if placed in other sects, would be the object of the sect's full protection. Resources would be given to him, and he would receive the meticulous guidance of a master. All kinds of escorts and escorts. Although I, Xianyuan, disdain these things, in fact, these things have to be done. After all, talents are hard to come by. However, this cigarette butt's experience is strange. In the dome, the support of the inner sword sect is stronger than the support of the external sword sect? What is the reason for this? Was he trying to push away the talents? So much so that when he formed his gold core, in order to avoid trouble, he would rather stay in the Weijian mountain and cultivate in seclusion. Xianyuan swordsman, in his own sect, actually did not feel any care, but instead felt that it was troublesome. Just based on this point alone, your actions are incompetent. Gu Dong was very embarrassed. This perfected master had a fair temperament. In fact, this was the most common opinion among the external cultivators. He needed to explain, otherwise, the perfected master's opinions would have a great impact on the Jing Dan working in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. Martial uncle, this disciple's level is not high enough, so I don't know the details. However, I heard that this person's special treatment came from the palace master of the Rising Heaven Pavilion, perfected Lord Gong Yao. Perfected Master Rui was startled. That's a good excuse. Pavilion Master Gong Yao left the fifth ring 100 years ago and never returned. Where can I go to find proof? Who told you about this? It can't be Pavilion Master Gong Yao who told you this personally, right? Gu Dong blushed with shame. No, it's Martial Uncle Lu who told me. Several other colleagues were also present. Perfected Master Rui was even more speechless. Junior brother Lu? He seemed to have also gone out to have fun 80 years ago, right? I heard that he went on a punitive expedition to an unruly star field. Gu Dong, can you tell me who's at home right now? Gu Dong was also in a difficult position. Martial uncle, there's no one else. That's why there's Cigarette Butt's name in the Thousand Talents Red Book and all the things that happened after. Perfected Master Rui shook his head. Too irresponsible. Too careless. That includes Pavilion Master Gong Yao, Junior Brother Lu, and all of you. Gu Dong stood solemnly and received the lecture. This perfected Master Rui was not an ordinary Yuanying. He was one of the strongest perfected swords of Thousand Talents Peak. In the future, he was very likely to go one step further and take over the Rising Heaven Pavilion's authority. His words could not be careless. Perfected Master Rui pondered. Special treatment. Perhaps Pavilion Master Gong Yao saw something at that time. This could be a bad thing, but it could also be a good thing. Pavilion Master's words were vague, so there's no way to verify it now. However, there's no need to ask what kind of situation it is. Just look at the Inner Sword's attitude and you'll know. The Inner Sword has always been supporting him. I heard that he even opened the Fan Lu to him. What does this mean? On one hand, he supports him, on the other hand, he spread rumors about the reincarnation of a sword pill. In my opinion, it's nonsense. This is to drive a wedge between this disciple and the outer sword. Even if he has great achievements in the future, he will still be close to the inner sword and alienate the outer sword. As an outer sword, his heart is with the inner sword. Isn't this laughable? More importantly, the inner sword scheme actually succeeded with the help of a group of idiots like you. In the years that I wasn't at Thousand Talents Peak, has Thousand Talents Peak lost their minds? Gu Dong was drenched in cold sweat. He was just a little old-fashioned, but he wasn't really selfish. Previously, he was schemed against by Wei Sword Mountain's Yin Yi. Now, he realized that he had been played by the Inner Sword's group of bastards. Chapter 491. Martial Uncle, what do you think about us? Reverend Ray waved his hand. It's fine. It's just an initial inclination, and it's far from having any results. I believe that this disciple is still loyal to my Qianxiu peak, it's just a misunderstanding. The key is the future. Don't push too hard, don't rush to change, and don't ask about his well-being in every possible way. If the change is too sudden, he won't be able to adapt to it. Don't restore his identity as the eldest martial brother, he doesn't need it now. Don't rush to call him back, just ask him what he needs during the process of breaking through and send it to him. Also, remove his red name, it's easy for people who don't know to misunderstand, just like you guys before. Help him naturally, without leaving any traces. His achievements in the Fish Leap realm are not only the pride of my external sword, but also the pride of the whole Xianyuan. He deserves all of this. This Brad is really scheming. Since the beginning of the 5 Rings ranking list, there had been 5 successful cultivators before him. Even if he succeeded, he would only be the 6th, so it wasn't that shocking. However, he could have succeeded, but he purposely lost to a Qi practitioner in the end. This indifference was different. He doesn't want to be famous, but instead, he wants to achieve greater fame, and he doesn't want to be tainted by karma. What a good scheme! Go with the flow and don't force him. As long as you don't lose your mind, this disciple will always be a member of the external sword Qianxiu peak. No matter how insidious his inner sword is, it won't change this fact. Reincarnation? The present world is the present world, it has nothing to do with the past or the future. Above the dome, because of the appearance of a wise and rational reverend who was wary of the inner sword, Lu Xiaoyi's situation began to turn normal. However, he didn't know about this. He lived very well in the Weijian mountain and was very casual. However, as time went by, he began to have sporadic visitors. Even though he was wearing a straw hat, the fact that he was cultivating in this residence was enough to prove his identity to a certain extent. His current state of cultivation was still not a complete state of seclusion. He still liked to stroll around and seek some peace and quiet. Among the 5 Ring Foundation establishment cultivators, his name had already spread far and wide. Although he wasn't the 6th person to complete the feat of inserting the sword into the ground, he was the first to abandon it after obtaining it. Cultivators liked this kind of talk. They thought that it was very lofty, that it was very temperamental, and that it was the true meaning of seeking the Tao. Little did they know that it was just a way for him to protect himself. It was very unscrupulous. Such a persona was very attractive. The Wei Sword Mountain was a straightforward orthodoxy. If you did not receive them, you would easily offend them. The reception was too cumbersome and he was not willing to seal himself in a specific area for so-called seclusion. There was a lot of trouble when one was famous, especially in his current state. It could be said that all 5 rings knew him. Now that he had shown his true face in front of tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators, where could he find peace and quiet? Even if he found a city or a town, he might not be able to avoid the troubles of the mortal world. On this day, a few more swordsmen from the Wei Sword Mountain came together. They wanted to see what a flying sword with a sword spirit was. This was an uncontrollable desire. For swordsmen, this desire was uncontrollable. However, there was no one in the residence. After asking around, it seemed that there was news from the dome. The person had already left through the teleportation formation. This was a very normal journey. It was somewhat unreasonable to not return to the mountain gate for decades. No one knew where the news came from, but no one doubted it. They could only sigh as they brushed past the strong cultivator. In a secluded place in the mine, 2 cultivators were waiting anxiously. Yinyi was very dissatisfied. "You little brat, you are really troublesome. You are not in seclusion, you are not in seclusion, you are not traveling, and you are still acting like you are ashamed to meet people. I really regret bringing you to the Wei Sword Mountain in the first place. There are so many troubles for no reason. Let me tell you again, that subordinate star is a desolate place with no traces of people. If I forget you, you might stay there for the rest of your life. Don't say that I didn't warn you in advance." Lu Xiai smiled. "With martial uncle's connections, you can really get whatever you want in the Wei Sword Mountain. All these years, I have to rely on martial uncle to live so comfortably in the Way Sword Mountain. In the end, I even escaped like a cicada. Of course, returning to Xianyuan through the teleportation formation was fake. It did not need to be done deliberately. He only needed to reveal a few words occasionally, and people would naturally spread the news. For a cultivator close to the core formation realm like him, returning to the sect was the right choice. It would be puzzling if he stayed in the Way Sword Mountain. However, he had other plans. Ever since he learned about the subordinate star from Taoist Wang Ding, he had some interest in it. After asking around, he found out that it was not a secret, so he knew about most of it. The subordinate star of the fifth ring was not very useful, and it did not belong to a specific force. No one would develop the subordinate star because its value was not high. 10,000 years ago, someone once proposed to migrate to a habitable subordinate star, but it was all talk and no action. Even if it was immortal, as long as they were not forced to that extent, who would be willing to leave the safety of the fifth ring and go to a small star with limited spiritual opportunity to develop? The most important thing was, if one day the small star did not follow the movement of the fifth ring, would they come back or not? So far, the subordinate star's function was only as a transit station for major cultivators. Because the distance was not far, the transit station's function was not obvious. Moreover, there was nothing to be added there. The only realistic and meaningful way was the messenger tower. In all directions around the fifth ring, the furthest subordinate star had a transmission device installed on it. Firstly, it was used to transmit information to the deep space of the universe. Secondly, it was used as a lighthouse to point the way. This function was not very useful to a perfected cultivator, but it was very useful to a large number of Yuanying perfected cultivators, especially Yuanying newbies. This kind of messenger tower was unguarded on a subordinate star without an atmosphere. No Yuanying perfected cultivator would be willing to guard such a barren place. It was often damaged by cosmic rays, ion winds, and collisions. It was also very troublesome to repair it. It was not a matter of technical ability, but a matter of who was responsible for it. There were also a few subordinate stars with an atmosphere that humans could live on. Therefore, the messenger tower would be guarded by people to prevent damage from wild beasts or other natural disasters. Because the spiritual vigor was low, it was close to a dead land. Therefore, there were no cultivators who were willing to come here. Only the strong sects would choose old foundation establishment cultivators who were about to die of old age. They would spend their last years alone on the subordinate star in order to obtain large amounts of resources or special protection from their sections. One of the subordinate stars was called the Star of Quicksand. It was a rare star with both an atmosphere and spiritual vigor. However, the entire star was in the form of a desert. It was not a place where humans could live. There was a messenger tower here that belonged to all the forces in the fifth ring. In the past 100 years, it was Way Sword Mountain's turn to send cultivators to guard the messenger tower. Therefore, Lu Xiao had the idea. Because he could be closer to the star here. Chapter 492. Lu Xi liked the place that others avoided like the plague. Seeing his absent-minded appearance, Yinye's head was filled with anger. Combat talent and cultivation talent are two different things. Don't think that just because you're good at fighting, you're also good at cultivation. You only reached the Jin Dan stage after 100 years. This kind of talent is very common in the fifth ring cultivation world. You're barely in the middle and lower levels. What's there to be proud of? Don't listen to senior brother Wang Ding's words about the state of mind. His words are based on the premise that there are enough resources. What resources can you have on Sand Planet? Spiritual opportunity is not as good as a fifth ring cultivator. There are no pills, no external objects, not even a protector. If you die, no one will collect your corpse. I'm warning you in advance. I won't do such unlucky things. Since you must go there, you'd better dig a hole for yourself. Lu Xiao said softly. I understand, martial uncle. This is not a whim, I'm sure. Yi snorted. He also knew that this person couldn't be persuaded. In fact, almost every cultivator with dreams and aspirations were like this. Once they made up their mind, nothing could change their mind. This was the characteristic of a true cultivator. However, there was really no danger on the sand planet. At least in the past 10,000 years, there were only people who died of old age, but no one died of accidents. As a signal tower, the past major cultivators would not stay on the sand planet. The only use they had for the sand planet was to transmit messages or adjust their course accordingly. However, they would not delay their landing. Yuanying, how bored would a perfected cultivator be to find trouble with a small foundation establishment cultivator? This was also the reason why the major powers only sent foundation establishment cultivators. Their realm was their best protection. Remember to use the signal tower. It's a waste not to use it. It's the only privilege of the cultivators stationed there. I'm afraid that some people will become crazy if they live alone on Sand Planet. I've already given you the identification beacons of Weijian Mountain and Xianyuan Firmament Sword Sect. If there are any changes, don't pretend to be a wolf. Your glory in Fish Leap is nothing compared to the universe. Don't think that saving you is a troublesome matter. It's nothing more than a few dozen days for a perfected person to cross. It's very easy. I'm willing to bet that the great cultivators left behind at the fifth ring in the sword vein can't wait to take a trip to the universe. Therefore, if you think this way, you're giving them a chance to do so. Lu Xiai smiled. It was nice to have someone caring for him, even though Yin Yi did not know how to truly care for someone. He was pulled into Weijian Mountain by Yin Yi. Even though he did not have a master, Yin Yi was playing the role of a master here, teaching a disobedient disciple a lesson. If I order a jug of wine and some food, will the delivery man, oh no, the real people, deliver it to me? Yin Yi snorted and said, I will. They'll even bring someone to replace you. Then, I'll bring your corpse back. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. He could understand what Yin Yi meant. Yin Yi wanted him to not be stubborn when he was in danger and to report first. Then, when he was not willing to stay there, he could just send a message. Wei Sword Mountain could find a replacement for him. Yin Yi saw a flying boat in the sky from afar and finally asked, You really don't want to consider finding a companion? It can also relieve your loneliness. Or find a kun cultivator to mess around with. If you have such thoughts, just say it. It's not shameful. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Martial uncle, am I that kind of person? If I want to find someone to talk to, why would I go to Sand Star? Wouldn't it be more convenient to stay here? Yin Yi was disdainful. What kind of upright person are you? Others might not know about the trivial matters in the Kun Daoli world, but I'm very well informed. As they spoke, the flying boat was in front of them. A Weijian Mountain spiritual master sat on it without raising his head or saying a word. Yin Yi signaled with his eyes. Lu Xiaoyi did a proper master's salute, and climbed onto the flying boat. When he sat down, he felt himself rising into the sky. When he looked down, Yin Ye's figure was only a small black dot. After coming to the fifth ring for 100 years, he didn't expect that the most talkative master was actually a swordsman. The affairs of the world were unpredictable. The flying boat quickly rose into the sky, passed through the atmosphere and rushed into the void. The rhythm was so fast that it was completely different from the medium-sized floating raft that Lu Xiaoyi came on before. However, Lu Xiaoyi didn't show any abnormality. Because now he was no longer the one who just entered the foundation establishment stage. He could be considered as an experienced foundation establishment stage cultivator. Once they exited the atmosphere, it was another lively scene. There were many flying boats, floating rafts, or cultivators who were flying with their physical bodies. Lu Xiaoyi reckoned that if it was not for him, who was a burden, with the character of the Wei Sword Mountain sword cultivators, they would have used their own physical bodies to cross the atmosphere. So far, Lu Xiaoyi didn't know the name of this spiritual master. If the spiritual master didn't say it, he couldn't ask. Everyone had their own habits and temper. Those with lower abilities could only follow those with higher abilities. This was the reality. The journey wasn't peaceful. Because although this spiritual master didn't talk much, he didn't stop at all. He had only been out for 3 days, but he had already fought with people of all sizes. He didn't understand why he fought with others, or why he fought with others, or why he went to join in the fun when others were fighting fiercely. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. You still have a mission, okay? If something happened to you, how could you leave me, a mere foundation establishment stage cultivator, to wander around the universe? It's too unreliable. Fortunately, although the spiritual master was a little mean, he was indeed powerful. He couldn't be said to be invincible, but at least he didn't suffer losses. He fought and killed along the way. As he got further and further away from the 5th ring, the probability of encountering other cultivators became lower and lower. The frequency of the fights finally slowed down. Only now did he understand that these fights didn't seem to be a life and death battle. They were more like a form of mutual recognition. With his current level, he couldn't understand the techniques of the spiritual masters. He couldn't even distinguish the true meaning of the fights. In his mind, the swordsman of Weijian Mountain was very powerful, but he never thought that the person who led him to the Sand Planet might not be the spiritual master of Weijian Mountain, but the spiritual master of Rising Heaven Pavilion of Qianxiu Peak. He knew very little about the relationship between the 3 sects of Sword Vein. How could Yi have the guts to let an outstanding cultivator like him go to the Sand Planet outside the 5th ring alone? He must be recognized by the Rising Heaven Pavilion. The ignorant Lu Xiaoyi was carried into the deep space. He was different from other Foundation establishment stage cultivators who had no sense of direction at all. He had an accurate judgment of his own position, the position of the 5 rings behind him, and the position of the Sand Planet. This was the advantage of studying the star system. Of course, the past experiences of his soul also played a part in this. Cultivators didn't get dizzy from floating rafts and flying boats, but most of them got dizzy from the starry sky. When trillions of stars were coming at them, who knew where they were? Chapter 493. The airship flew for almost a month. In Lu Xiaoyi's opinion, if the perfected master didn't like fighting, they could have been faster. During the whole journey, the 2 of them didn't speak a word. Lu Xiaoyi could understand that they didn't have anything in common. A perfected master with a bright future and a Foundation establishment cultivator who was destined to live on the Sand Planet, what could they talk about? Among the many planets in the universe that were suitable for living creatures, there was one thing in common: color. The color was basically between blue and green, because living creatures couldn't live without water. However, the Sand Planet was yellow in color, which was basically synonymous with a desolate planet, even if it had an atmosphere and a certain amount of spiritual energy. In terms of size, the size of the Sand Planet was a bit like the moon in his previous life. Only such a small size could be captured by the gravitational force of the 5th ring and become one of the satellites of the 5th ring. The atmosphere of the Sand Planet was very thin, so thin that it seemed like it would collapse at any time. However, the magic of nature was that the Sand Planet had survived for tens of thousands of years. No matter how thin the atmosphere was, it was still a planet that humans could barely survive on. Of course, this referred to the cultivators, not the large number of mortals. The airship swooped down, passing through the thin atmosphere. Lu Xiaoyi saw a 1,000 feet tall sand tower in his line of sight, getting closer and closer. However, the airship didn't land. Instead, it circled a few thousand feet in the air. Then, Lu Xiaoyi felt an irresistible force pushing him out of the airship. The airship shook and passed through the atmosphere again, disappearing without a trace. Was it necessary? Lu Xiaoyi didn't have time to complain, because the first problem he had was how to balance his body. He could fly, but the environment was different, and the flying conditions were different. Simply put, because the Sand Planet was too small, the gravity here was completely different from that of the 5th ring. He needed to familiarize himself with the specific environment here before falling to the ground. It wasn't difficult. He was just not used to it. It was like a person who lived on Earth being suddenly thrown to the moon. First, he had some understanding of the sand tower. After seeing it for himself, he couldn't help but admire Dishio's ability from the bottom of his heart. Originally, he thought that in a planet like Sand Star, which was almost entirely a desert, the materials used to build the sand tower must have been brought in by cultivators from outside. Dishio had such ability. But now, it seemed that the construction of the sand tower was simply based on local materials. It was very magical. It was probably due to the basic principles of the 5 elements that he could not understand. Not only would it not be destroyed in the sandstorm, but it was also a self-replenishing process. The sand tower was different from a normal human pagoda. The interior space did not take into account the living habits of humans, so the structure was completely different. There were no obvious layers and no stairs. Basically, it was a huge vertical formation that supported the entire structure of the sand tower. Hanging in the air, looking around, he could already faintly see the arc of the horizon in the distance. This was the characteristic of a small planet. He couldn't go any higher. If he went any higher, he would be out of the gas layer. He didn't have the ability to survive in the void of the universe. The first thing he did when he landed on Sand Planet was to fly around the planet in order to determine its true size. This process took him 5 days. For a Foundation establishment cultivator with his pitiful speed, it only took him 5 days to fly around a planet. It was clear that this planet was also very small. What he saw in the 5 days was only yellow sand. The geography of the entire sand star, except for the area around the sand tower where soil could be seen because of the highest terrain, was basically covered by desert. This was the only thing on Sand Star. There were creatures, but they were all low-level creatures that were still in the early stages of evolution. If this kind of environment didn't change, perhaps after tens of thousands of years, spiritual beasts would be born, but not now. In Inya's words, Sand Star should be a fragment of a huge nebula that collapsed after the explosion. By chance, because it hadn't completely formed its own orbit, it was captured by the passing 5th ring. Another strong feeling was the large temperature difference. This was also a common problem of small stars with thin atmosphere. Because there was not enough thickness of the atmosphere to cushion, the temperature change was not as gentle as that of a normal star. Cultivators could still withstand it, but for mortals, this was hell. But for Lu Xiaoyi, this was actually a good thing. Because of the thin atmosphere, he was closer to the billions of stars in the universe. This was beneficial for his cultivation of the stars. For someone who placed the direction of core formation in the direction of the stars, Sand Star was a more suitable place than the 5th ring. When he came back and stood at the top of the sand tower, he looked around and saw a vast expanse of yellow sand. Occasionally, there would be wind blowing, covering the sky and earth. The entire sky was gray and hazy, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of independence. And this feeling was familiar. It was the feeling he had in the Gobi Desert on his mother planet. It was intimate and distant. He didn't expect that after 100 years of Foundation establishment cultivation, he would return to the starting point of the desert. Was this a coincidence? Overall, this kind of environment was not beyond his expectations. It was within the acceptable range. The sky was gray, the sand was boundless, and the wind blew the dust up, but no sheep could be seen. Lu Xiaoyi completely relaxed here, because this place was most suitable for the 2 stages of his life that he had the deepest feelings for. One was the loneliness he had developed during countless years of wandering in the universe, and the other was the Gobi Desert where he had just entered the human world to learn and grow. Here, through the thin atmosphere, he had an impulse to penetrate it, and then merge with the vast and deep space of the universe. He didn't need to think about anything else. This was the deepest feeling he had since he had transmigrated. There was another kind of feeling. As a native of the mother planet, young Master Sima had a deep attachment to the environment of Pooh City. Daily work? It didn't exist. The operation of the sand tower was completely controlled by the internal mechanism of the 5 elements. There was no possibility of it being damaged. As long as the 5 elements existed, it would continue to grow and multiply. Lu Xiaoyi's job was to replenish the formation with spirit stones on time. The spiritual vigor in this place was much worse than in the 5th ring. The formation's speed of gathering spiritual vigor could not keep up with its consumption. This was because the sand tower was constantly emitting its own information waves in all directions in the deep space of the universe, so that the cultivators passing by could determine their specific location. In such a lighthouse-like place, it was actually hard to keep people here. However, if there were people here, they could deal with many unexpected situations. There were also cultivators who proposed to replace it with items with spiritual intelligence. They would be more conscientious in their duties and wouldn't need to be replaced for thousands of years. However, items with spiritual intelligence were hard to come by, and there were countless cultivators in the Foundation establishment realm. It went without saying which method to choose. Lu Xiaoyi finally found a place where he didn't need to worry about being disturbed by others, and where he could come and go as he pleased. At least at this stage, the Sand Star belonged to him alone. Chapter 494. To Lu Xiaoyi, cultivating in a place like Sand Star had both advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was that the spiritual vigor was thin, which was the biggest disadvantage for cultivators at the level of Foundation establishment. They couldn't come into contact with other forms of spiritual vigor other than the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth. The advantage was that he was close to the stars, which could allow his entire cultivation system to be in the best state. For cultivators who had basically met the conditions for core formation, their cultivation had already reached the peak of Foundation establishment. For the time being, they didn't have an urgent need for spiritual vigor. Instead, they had some demands in terms of mental state. In terms of breaking through to the upper realm, this place was suitable. The upper realm of a cultivator was never a process that could be planned, because you couldn't judge when God would open his eyes and give you a chance. Under normal circumstances, when a cultivator's cultivation reached the peak and he had his own comprehension in mental state, he could roughly realize whether he was in the preparation stage for core formation. This stage required many prerequisites. For example, Lu Xiaoyi raised his cultivation to the peak in the 50 years in the peacock plume. Then, he made a deep reflection on his mental state and the fish leaping cliff. Only then did he begin to realize that he had reached this step. What would a cultivator do next? Everyone had their own path to guide them. Thousands of people had thousands of paths, and none of them were alike. However, there was one thing that was the most impossible way to reach core formation if you just sat at home and waited for a pie to fall from the sky. Therefore, most cultivators chose to go out, to see, to travel, to fight, to experience the world of mortals, to experience life and death. The meaning of doing so was to find their own chance. The way of heaven was fair to every cultivator. Everyone would have that chance when they reached this stage. The key was whether they could find it or not. Triggering the resonance of the heart? Then, they would understand their own direction and work hard in this direction to seek a process from quantitative change to qualitative change. Old Man High Toads. Jin Dan Song. Refining into Qi and returning to Jin 1, refining Qi into Zichen. The Wuzheng chapter said Qi was born from nothingness, and Yin and Yang were born from Qi. Taoist Shurs. Returning to Source chapter said Qi was the fate of the form. There was the Qi of Jin 1, born before heaven and earth, and obtained from nothingness. It was in a trance, invisible, unseen, unheard, unobtainable. How could it condense into millet pearls? The Saint Gai Xing used reality to form emptiness, and form to form. The two were like the same thing. The so-called one referred to the condensation of the innate true one Qi into a grain of pearls. The Qitong contract said, branches, stems, flowers, leaves, and fruits hang down. They are the same as their roots, without losing their essence. Wuzheng chapter said, all kinds of non-human labor, like real lead and divine machine. The secret map states, Li Na Ji is the sun, fire, heart, cinnabar, dragon, and Mercury, Cana Wu is the moon, water, kidney, lead, tiger, and chi. The Golden Jade Sutra said. Inside the cave of the fortune spring, yang energy emanates from the earth, the sundial arrives from the south, the 5 stars align, the sun and the moon combine. The pure yang ancestral master once said. Spirit, chi, and blood belong to the 3 essences, north, south, east, and west. Almost every orthodoxy had its own unique description of Jin Dan. It was precisely because they said too much that people were at a loss for what to do. Among them, the Shizhenjing was the most direct. 3 inches below the navel is the lower dantian, 4 inches in radius, between the spine and the kidneys, green on the left and white on the right, yellow on the top and black on the bottom, and red in the center. It is called the Great Sea, which stores blood and chi. It is also called the Great Middle, which is the center of the 4 directions of the human body. The central position is the dantian, the golden embryo divine chamber. Cultivators needed resources to form their aura's core, and for most people, this was also their goal. However, people were different. When one's ability reached Lu Xiaoyi's level, he did not need to worry about resources. The sect would automatically release all restrictions for him. It was not giving, but borrowing. There was no limit or quality. If he did not return the dantian after it was formed, no one would pursue it. In fact, it was a form of support. This was the inevitable strategy of every orthodoxy for their disciples. As long as you were outstanding enough, you did not need to sacrifice yourself. In the big sects, as long as you could enter the top hundreds, you would not need to worry about resources. In the small sects, as long as you could squeeze into the ranking, you would receive a lot of resources from the sect. The resources were biased towards the top, and the top would lead the sect after they achieved something. This was a virtuous cycle. Lu Xiaoyi did not lack resources in his storage ring. They were all provided to him by Yinyi. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to accept them at first, but Yinyi quickly dispelled his misgivings and told him that these things were provided by Qianxiu Peak, and were part of the reward for his sacrifice. Lu Xiaoyi didn't really want to settle the score with Qian Xiufen. He wouldn't be able to figure it out, and it would only make him feel distant. He was no longer the same person who had just entered the sect. He wanted to convert every bit of hard work he had put in into spirit stones. He had a high view of things. It was fine as long as he had enough for his own use. How could he really count the value of each fish's head with his fingers? Cultivation was just as strange. When a cultivator did not have any resources, they would place all their hopes on resources. When there were enough resources, they would discover that there were more important things, just like what Taoist Wang Ding had said. He was not in a hurry, so there was nothing to be anxious about. It was precisely because he wanted to leave more time for himself that he sent himself to this barren desert. He was already close to 150 years old this year. As Yinyi had said, he was not a talented cultivator. Cultivators with 5 rings and above were generally able to form their gold core before they were 100 years old. He was not even close to that. Cultivators with average cultivation talent would form their gold core around 150 years old. As for those with even later cultivation talent, there was no need to mention them. The good news was that his 2 friends, Yan Bo and Yan Qing, were not much stronger than him. However, he could feel that the 2 of them had already reached his current state decades ago. It was just that they had never found their own opportunity. When they went to Fish Leap to observe the sword, it was not impossible that they did not want to comprehend their own opportunity from other people's battles. At the very most, he still had 50 years. It sounded like a lot, but in fact, it was only the time he would spend in the peacock plume space. For the vast majority of cultivators who had hopes of forming their gold core, they would have several decades of time to either go up or remain silent. Since Lu Xiaoyi had forced himself to this place, he had never thought of changing to another environment. To him, he could never find another place so close to the universe's starry sky, where no one would disturb him, and where he could be free. He really dug a deep sand pit for himself in front of the sand pagoda. The 4 walls of the sand pit were reinforced with simple moisture-proof and insect-proof structures. This way, if he died, he would be able to lie down more comfortably. He did not leave an epitaph because he was afraid that someone would rob his grave. He also did not prepare a pearl in his mouth because he was afraid that he would turn into a zombie after several hundred years. When Lu Shi did all this, it was as if he was digging a pit for someone else. There was not the slightest ripple in his heart. This was his true nature. He was indifferent to everything. Chapter 495. Lu Xiaoyi's schedule was very regular. In fact, there was no need for him to focus on any particular direction of swordsmanship. His main focus was the strength of the 7 sword spirits. He needed to bridge the gap between them and not think of the 4 seasons or Ju Qing whenever he fought. This was not beneficial to the diversity of his swordsmanship. Every day, the sword spirits were released to roar between heaven and earth. This was their happiest time. However, this was also the happiest time of their organization and discipline. This was because they were not out for a walk, but to practice their swordsmanship. Lu Xiaoyi did not deliberately pursue anything. This was different from when he first started learning swordsmanship. He did not need to tire himself out like a dog. In his arrangement for himself, the most important thing was that he must set aside a few hours of idle time every day, allowing him to wander around, let his imagination run wild, or look up at the starry sky in a daze. He looked at the stars, counted them, and savored the eternity of time. Correspondingly, the extremely viscous transcendence energy in his dantian slowly flowed through the ripples of starlight. At his current level, the number of stars he could perceive was close to 300. This was also the source of his star power. According to the Big Dipper star scripture, he could actually activate his cultivation technique and enter the core formation state at any time, but he did not do so. Core formation was a technical job. It required a long-term strategy. Xuanyuan's Great Tao cultivation techniques included the Great Tao cultivation techniques of all the sects in the 5 rings. When a cultivator was at a critical juncture, there would be a corresponding secret technique. It was not completely a matter of luck and waiting for the heavenly Tao to open its eyes. For example, the Big Dipper scripture of the star system. When a cultivator's transcendence energy and spirit reached a certain level, and the cultivator felt that his state of mind, transcendence energy, and body were enough to withstand the impact of core formation, then he could activate the secret technique and enter the core formation state. With a large amount of resources, he could charge towards the upper level. The problem was that the secret technique did not guarantee a 100% success rate. In fact, if a cultivator wasn't meticulous enough in other aspects, or if there was a fundamental error in the direction of their core formation, or if there was a flaw in their state of mind, etc., even if they used a secret technique, the chances of success were very slim. This was the reason why most cultivators would fail time and time again at the core formation stage. Secret techniques could advance the process of core formation from a technical standpoint. However, it couldn't influence the direction of the core formation process. What really influenced the success of the core formation process was many other things, some mysterious and unseen reasons. Therefore, the preparations before a cultivator's core formation were not something that could be done on a whim. They needed to spend a very long time to sort out their own cultivation path, ideals, direction, and so on. It was equivalent to looking back on one's own life and finding the thing that was closest to one's heart. Those so-called successful people who had a flash of inspiration had already made preparations in this aspect long ago. They were only waiting for that trace of inspiration in the unseen world. Of course, the Big Dipper scripture also had a secret technique to activate the core formation. Moreover, as a top-notch Great Tao technique, it contained more than one secret technique. It was divided into 3 types: the 7 stars core formation technique, the 4-9 galaxies technique, and the heavenly cycle illumination technique. The 7 stars core formation technique referred to relying on the 7 stars of the Big Dipper to form the core. This was also the most common core formation technique in Taoism. Because ordinary cultivators were limited by their own aptitude and affinity with the stars, they didn't have the opportunity to get close to the stars under the dense and thick atmosphere. Therefore, for many people, it was very realistic to only comprehend a dozen stars in their lifetime. It was very normal for them to choose the 7 stars core formation technique when they finally formed their core. The 4-9 galaxies technique was not something that every cultivator who cultivated the stars could do. It required the cultivator to have an extraordinary talent for the stars and to be able to comprehend the power of more than 49 stars, including the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, within a short 100 years of foundation establishment. As for the heavenly cycle illumination technique, it required the cultivator to comprehend more than 365 stars. When they formed their core, it was as if they were bathing in the real Milky Way. It was a true high-grade technique, but also a freak technique, because basically no one had the ability to do this. What was the difference between secret techniques that used different stars to form their core? It wasn't in power. Instead, it was in the future cultivation technique's depth and success rate. The more stars the secret technique used during the core formation, the higher the margin for error, and the easier it was to achieve the gene Dan. However, how could it be easy to perceive more stars? For a cultivator of the star system, it was a contradiction between perceiving more stars to increase the success rate during the core formation, or studying the 7 stars of the Big Dipper in exchange for more time to break through. Lu Xiaoyi's path could only be the heavenly cycle illumination technique, because his affinity with the stars had already surpassed 7 stars when he was still in the early stages of foundation establishment. When he was in the middle stages of foundation establishment, he had nearly 100 stars. When he was in the great circle of foundation establishment, and felt the desire to form his core, his comprehension of the stars had already neared 300. There was no reason for him not to use so much of his comprehension of the stars to increase his success rate during the core formation. Therefore, he had come here, where the atmosphere was thin, in order to complete the core formation as soon as possible. 50 years, at least 1 star a year. The time frame was still considered relaxed. Lu Xiaoyi hoped that this would be a leisurely period of time, and not one where he would be forced to become a dog by the pressure. If the burden was too heavy, it would cause a psychological imbalance, and the gains would not make up for the losses. He did not do anything strange. He did not carefully examine the desert on this planet inch by inch, nor did he dig a well to try to find something. His behavior was exactly the same as that of every old cultivator who had been sent here. He guarded the sand tower and passed day after day in boredom. In fact, he had no interest in the sand planet itself. He also did not think that this planet would have anything special left for him after 10,000 years of cultivators staying here. His attention was not on this. Instead, it was on a certain area in the void where the tall spire of the message pagoda pointed. His star system was different from normal star system. The difference was that his star system was a combination of the stars of the positive and negative worlds. This gave him a powerful fighting strength, and it was impossible for the stars to be blocked by others. There were countless benefits. However, the disadvantage was that when he formed his core, he would not only need the support of the stars of the positive world, but also the stars of the negative world. This was basically impossible for a mere foundation establishment cultivator to do with his own ability. If he wanted to break through the negative world, he would need a powerful foreign floating raft, at least the cultivation strength of a Yuanying expert. Moreover, he was not sure how to do it. When the floating raft jumped between the 2 worlds, how would he distribute the proportion of the stars he sensed? Time? How much? If he needed a day to form his core, would he have to let others ride the floating raft and go back and forth between the 2 worlds for a day? Would he start from the positive world and then go to the negative world? Or would he stay in the jumping state and feel the stars of the 2 worlds at the same time? Would it be easy to maintain this state? There were too many uncertainties. He did not have the heart to find others to help him. Whether it was the Taoist masters of the Thousand Virtues Peak or Weijian Mountain, or the mysterious sacred weapon in the Peacock Palace. When a cultivator needed someone to help him form his core, he would fall into a disadvantage. Chapter 496. Then, how could a mere Foundation establishment cultivator come into contact with the antimatter space that even a perfected master couldn't understand? Couldn't he ask for help? The only way he could think of was through the signal tower. The signal tower on the subordinate star. The signal tower on the solitary sand planet didn't have such a function in other directions. The function of the signal tower was to guide the cultivators. It allowed the cultivators to accurately determine their position in the vast void. But there were some cultivators who needed the signal tower's guidance even more. Those were the floating rafts flying in the antimatter space. If they wanted to return to the fifth ring at the correct point in space, they could only rely on the signal tower to guide them. In other words, if there was an antimatter floating raft in the fifth ring that wanted to jump out, it could only appear in the space near the solitary sand planet. Lu Xiaoyi was on the solitary sand planet, so he could observe the process of the space jump at a close distance. In other words, if he formed his core quickly, he could obtain the effects of the stars of the two worlds at the same time during the jump of the floating raft. He knew that this was the key to his core formation. When he obtained the boost of the stars in the opposite space, he didn't understand anything. He only knew that there were benefits. But he didn't know that every benefit in the cultivation world came with a price. The three Pure Ones cultivators used their sect's most powerful dimensional-reducing spiritual tool to isolate the senses of the stars, but it couldn't do anything to him. This also meant that he would have to pay the price for his abnormal combat ability in the future. The Big Dipper scripture that Lu Xiaoyi learned was an incomplete prerequisite cultivation method. He also believed that when he reached the Yuanying True Monarch realm in the future, a top-grade cultivation method like the Big Dipper scripture would definitely mention the problem of the compensation of the stars in the antimatter space, and it would be solved in his cultivation and upper realm. The problem was that his steps were too fast, and he was straining his balls. He had obtained something that only the Yuanying class could come into contact with until now, but he couldn't do the method that the Yuanying cultivators used to solve this problem. Without a practical secret technique, even if he could obtain the second half of the Big Dipper scripture, how could a mere Foundation establishment cultivator like him do something that only perfected masters and true monarchs could use? Lu Xiaoyi could only think of a way himself. As a result, he came to Sand Star and gazed at the starry sky by the message tower every day. That was not to be silent and foolish, but to experience what he could gain every time a floating raft returned from the negative world and a short transition passage opened. This was not something that could be solved by the appearance of a floating raft. Lu Xiaoyi was calculating the approximate frequency of the floating raft's appearance. The length of time each time he came out? What does time have to do with anything? Was it the size of the floating raft? Or could it be completely controlled by humans? Wait a minute, these things required him to observe and record day after day to form data, and then extract what he really needed from them. It was rare even for a fifth-ring bandit to rob someone through the antimatter space. After 10 years of observation, Lu Xiaoyi realized that it was far less frequent than he had imagined. There were occasional deviations, but basically, it maintained the rhythm of a floating raft returning every 2 to 3 months. He had been here for 10 years, but the total number of times he had seen the floating raft return from breaking through the wall was no more than 53. Through these 53 observations, he realized that to him, there was far more bad news than good news. The most terrible thing was that the time it took for a single raft to jump from the negative world to the main world was very short. From the moment he felt the energy fluctuations in the space, Lu Xiaoyi focused all his attention on that space. From the time the space opened, the floating raft split open, to the time the floating raft completely entered the main world, and the transition passage began to close, the entire process did not take more than 10 breaths. Large and medium-sized floating rafts took 100 breaths. Some powerful individuals' powerful assault rafts could pass through the transition passage in the shortest time of 10 breaths. It was truly incomparably fast. Lu Xiaoyi could understand that the shorter the time, the safer it was for the cultivator on the raft, and the less chance of being ambushed by the enemy. But to him, the space passage was so short, and the time was calculated in breaths. How could it be used as a window to break through to the core formation realm? Plans and reality were often filled with endless contradictions. The things that Lu Xiaoyi calculated in his plans were actually worthless when he actually brought them to the actual situation. The only possible opportunity was the fleet. In the 3rd year after Lu Xiaoyi arrived at the Sand Planet, he encountered such a fleet. Dozens of large and medium-sized floating rafts lined up to pass through, and the entire process lasted for no less than an hour. This was the best opportunity he had ever seen. He could sense the power of the stars in the negative world the entire time. However, he could never be sure whether the next one to appear would be a small floating raft or a large one. Or a fleet. This made him unable to make any preparations in advance. It could be solved. Lu Xiaoyi secretly comforted himself. There was always something that he had not thought of. Maybe it could solve all his problems. While he was paying attention to the starry sky, he was also carefully observing the sand tower's array. He did not want to understand it. With his level of insight, even if he looked at it for 10,000 years, he would not be able to understand the mechanism of the array. However, if he wanted to see something on the surface, it would be enough. For example, if there was a floating raft approaching from the antimatter world, appearing, breaking through the wall, and leaving, would there be any changes in the signal tower during this series of events? What was the difference between the signal strength and the degree of interference? He was just looking at the surface and deducing some substantial things from it. After 10 years, Lu Xiaoyi had accurately grasped the series of changes in the signal tower when the floating raft approached in the antimatter world. According to his judgment, the signal tower's signal would provide more frequent location information when the floating raft approached, allowing the array on the floating raft to constantly self-locate. At this time, with his ability to judge the signal strength and energy, he could roughly predict the arrival of the floating raft 2 days in advance. The success rate was above 90%. When the signal tower's signal began to become chaotic, it meant that the floating raft was close to breaking through the wall and leaving. This time was only a few moments. In other words, when the signal tower's signal began to be disrupted, the floating raft would inevitably appear. The success rate of this judgment was 100%. There had never been a mistake. What he was afraid of was the word serious. With Lu Xiaoyi's soul from his previous life, the antimatter world, which was generally understood by those who were at least at the level of true monarch, was just the tip of the iceberg in front of him. He could now, to a certain extent, solve the problem of the floating raft's appearance. This was very important. It meant that he could carry out some basic preparations before forming his Azoth core in advance, and fix the time window to the moment the transition channel opened. For example, if he predicted the arrival of the floating raft, he could form his Azoth core a day in advance. He would start with the main world stars. After reaching a certain level, he would wait for the transition channel to open. He would then quickly use the channel to deal with the stars in the antimatter world to assist his Jin Dan. Chapter 497. P.S. Adding an update for the friends who pulled out their swords and left. Although you guys left me, I still remember the help you guys gave me. Happy studying! But there was still a problem that had not been solved. The transition channel was too short. This seemed to be an unsolvable problem. He had no experience in core formation. The star pill was a rare exception in the Xianyuan sword school. There were only a few cases, and the occasional cases were all 7-star pill condensation pills. It did not mean much to him. So he had no idea how long the transition channel needed to be opened during the core formation process to ensure that he could make full use of the stars in the antimaterial world. Although he was not clear, he was afraid that the short time of 10 breaths was not enough. He could not control the thoughts of Jinren and Supreme Immortals. This was a fatal flaw. But Lu Xiaoyi was not a person who gave up easily. He still had a glimmer of hope, and that was the arrival of a large fleet. 7 years ago, a large fleet appeared, But Lu Xiaoyu was not ready at that time. He hoped that in the next few decades, he would be lucky again. The fifth ring was a den of bandits. It should not be rare for a group to go out and rob, right? Time passed slowly in Lu Xiaoyu's careful plan. When a person lived alone on a dead planet, time always passed slowly. But he had a lot of things to do, so he felt that time was not passing slowly enough. Another 20 years passed in a flash. It had been 30 years since he first landed on Sand Planet. During this time, he successfully increased the number of stars he could perceive to more than 365. This was the result of the star perception in the main world. In the anti-material world, there was no need to perceive so many. Every skill had a primary and secondary. Since he lived in the main world, of course, he would focus on this place. In theory, he already had the basic conditions to activate the heavenly cycle illumination technique and enter the core formation stage. But he was still waiting. He was waiting for the last and most important piece of the puzzle in the core formation process. It was he who forced himself to this point. If he did not discover the secret of the anti-material world when he returned to the fifth ring through the anti-material world, if he did not have the 50 years of experience in the anti-material world in the peacock plume space, without these, he would only be an ordinary cultivator pursuing the upper realm. The secret technique of the Big Dipper Sutra was enough for him. Of course, if not for this, he would not have been able to suppress all the heroes at Fish Leaping Cliff. In the Great Tao, you had to pay the price for what you gained. There was nothing that didn't come with a price. During this period of time, he had a more thorough understanding of the appearance of floating rafts from the antimatter world. Through the changes in the signal tower and the intensity of the signal disturbance, he was able to accurately determine the size and number of floating rafts in the antimatter space of this airspace. According to his deduction, 3 or 4 floating rafts were not enough time to pass through the passage. What he needed was a large fleet with dozens of floating rafts. Only then would he have enough time to complete his core formation. He believed that there would be one, so he had been waiting. In the process, he even tampered with the signal tower. Of course, it was not a change. He did not have the ability to do so, nor did he have the knowledge to do so. He did not even dare to change any of the lines, for fear that he would accidentally destroy the beacon tower and ruin his plans. His change was very simple, and it was within the scope of his authority. It was to lower the energy level of the array. Simply put, the array of the signal tower was powered by supreme-grade spirit stones. Every supreme-grade spirit stone would be replaced with a brand new spirit stone when more than half of its spiritual energy was depleted. This was the rule, one of the few rules that the guardian of the signal tower had to abide by. However, Lu Xiaoyu purposely mixed in some supreme-grade spirit stones that were more than half depleted. The purpose was to test the influence of the strength of the energy supply on the signal tower. He had made such preparations over the past few decades. He did not know what it was like for others to form their core, but his was full of risks, coincidences, luck, and gambling. Will I have luck? Observing the lifeless cloud of fate in his mind, Lu Xiaoyu was very curious. He had swallowed a lot of other people's fate, but he was still in a half-dead state. This cheat was really useless. However, something as high and mighty as fate was not something that a mere foundation establishment like him could come into contact with, right? Perhaps the future would be better? Time passed slowly as he waited. He had already prepared so much, and he did not want to change anything. Besides, he could not think of any other Jin Dan that he could achieve. The celestial core was the most suitable for him, and it was also the core that he had been immersed in for more than 100 years. It was said that a cultivator could not go all the way, and could not be stubborn. However, when you were really in the middle of it, you would find that you really had no choice. In the anti-material world, a long fleet of interstellar rafts was moving quickly. There were more than 20 rafts in the fleet, and a very special thing was that the rafts were made in various shapes. At first glance, it was obvious that they did not come from the same star field. Among them, there were 5 black rafts that obviously came from the same star field. On the heads of these black rafts, there was a prominent symbol of the 5 rings, indicating their terrifying origin. Among the 5 black rafts, some were in the front, some were at the back, and some were patrolling on the flanks. Looking at their flying positions, it was easy to guess what the situation of the other 20 rafts were. They were the spoils of war brought back from this large-scale expedition of the 5 rings. In the history of the 5 rings, such forced plundering was common, and it happened almost every year. Some were the actions of individual cultivators, some were the actions of a certain force, and some were the actions of an alliance. Judging from the scale of this team, it was an alliance. It was a joint operation of the bandits of the 5th ring, big and small. Of course, it was not hard to predict that their opponents would not be ordinary small cultivation realms, but rather the strong cultivation forces of the big cultivation realms. Although there were not many such forces, they could always be encountered in the 5 rings world. It happened once every few hundred years, and it had never failed. The bandits returned with a full harvest, and in fact, they were not too worried about encountering any accidents. In the anti-material world, except for a certain sacred place that could not be spoken of, the other spaces were basically desolate, and there were no human cultivators living there. Although the rafts were made in different shapes, the ones controlling the rafts were all 5 rings cultivators. This was also the principle of the bandits. Other than precious goods, they only robbed foundation establishment cultivators. They did not even want Jingdan cultivators, let alone perfected Yuanning cultivators who had completed their great Tao. The 5 rings robbed people to supplement their own foundation, and to diversify their base, not to lack perfected cultivators and perfected immortals. In one of the mid-sized rafts in the outer space, there were piles of space storage devices piled up messily. There were also dozens of dispirited foundation establishment cultivators sitting there silently. The long journey had made them tired, and if they were in a bad mood, it would be a terrible trip. Chapter 498. P.S. I'm very sorry. When you joined the League, Sloth didn't pay attention, so he added the update late. I wanted to add one more update for you, but a poor man's ambition is short-lived. I really didn't have much stock left, so Sloth decided to be a thief. Thank you for your support, thank you very much. In addition, during the double update period, I would like to ask for everyone's help. Vote for me every month to earn some face. Secluded Ocean sat among the Foundation establishment cultivators. He was as listless as the other cultivators. These people, including the other Foundation establishment cultivators on the floating rafts, were all from the same domain. They were all low-level cultivators from a high-grade cultivation domain, the Sun-Top domain. The Sun-Top domain was very famous in the nearby universes. It was an existence that dominated several universes. It had a long history and produced many talented people. With hundreds of thousands of years of cultivation history, the Sun-Top domain cultivators had no opponents in their own universe that could compete with them. Until the bandits passed by. The 5th ring sect didn't come directly to the Sun-Top domain. Instead, they passed by the Sun-Top domain very far away. However, ever since the bandits heard about the wealth of the Sun-Top domain, they were very interested in going to pay their respects. At first, it was the joint effort of the Temple Lord and another large sect. In the end, they didn't return. They didn't manage to snatch anything, and most of the cultivators died at the Sun-Top domain. This wasn't much. The bandits were unbridled in the universe. In fact, it was inevitable that they would suffer losses. This was because they didn't gather their strength and underestimated their opponents. However, they didn't get wiped out many times. Hence, when the Temple Lord was wiped out this time, the 5th ring sect was very excited, because they finally met an opponent that they could fight to their heart's content. Next, it was the internal conscription of the Alliance. The Supreme 3 Pure Ones and other Law Veins main forces, Sword Vein fighters, Body Vein meat shields, and so on were very enthusiastic. The bandits had their own rules. How the spoils were divided depended on the effort. Next was the expedition. Of course, the strength of the bandits was only 20% to 30% of the fifth ring sect's strength. They invaded like fire and crushed everything along the way. After more than 10 years of fighting, they finally defeated the Sun-Top domain and returned with a full load. Their group of rafts was only the first wave of the expedition against the bandits. There were still many more to come. Collecting the spoils of war was also a very time-consuming task. The spoils of war did not only include goods, but also people. However, unlike the time when they had plundered Lu Xiaoyi, the Lu Xiaoyi had no sense of honor back then, but this batch of Foundation establishment cultivators did. This was because they had history, inheritance, and pride. Therefore, they had a sense of honor. They were both at the Foundation establishment stage, but assimilating them was much more difficult than assimilating Lu Xiaoyi and the others. However, the people at the fifth ring did not care about this. They believed that the charm of the fifth ring was enough to dilute everything with time. In the eyes of the real grand cultivators, it was actually not important how many of the building foundation stage cultivators they captured from the outside world could truly become useful. What was important was that these newcomers could bring the bloodline and luck that originally belonged to their mother planet. That was the most important thing. The heavenly Tao could not always favor the fifth ring. There would come a day when the providence of the other realms would come. The strategy of the fifth ring was that no matter who had providence, this place was the melting pot of all realms. There were people everywhere, so the fifth ring naturally had a share of providence. Senior brother Yuhai, we've been flying for almost 3 years. Are we almost there? A brother beside him could not bear the loneliness and asked. These people did not come from the same sect or orthodoxy. They came from different sects and clans on the Sun Peak. After spending a long time together and empathizing with each other, they were very close. This was also why the people at the fifth ring were cunning. They would not allow the Foundation establishment cultivators from the same sect to gather together, so they were scattered on different floating rafts. This was also a kind of deep understanding of human nature. When they put a few fellow disciples together, it would be easy for them to gather together and encourage each other. They would also strengthen each other's meaningless ideals, such as how to take revenge after they succeeded. Yuhai sighed. Since we're here, let's take things as they come. Junior brother, you don't have to worry too much. People like us who have just formed our Tao Foundation can cultivate anywhere. From a personal point of view, there's no difference. The other cultivator beside him did not like what he heard. Senior brother Yuhai, what are you saying? It's only been 3 years. Have you forgotten all those grudges? The deaths of the patriarchs of the Three Sons sect, the losses of the sect, and the loss of resources, can you just ignore them? Can you recognize a thief as your father? This cultivator's words were approved by most of the Foundation establishment cultivators. Yuhai did not dare to talk back. If he did not do well, he might get beaten up. Even a fifth ring sage would not care. Why bother? He closed his eyes slightly and focused his mind, distancing himself from the chaos around him and the righteous indignation. Revenge should be kept in the heart, not just in the mouth. He did not know if there were others on this floating raft who had the same mission as him, and he did not care. To him, it was enough to do what he should do. His goal was very simple. It was to locate the fifth ring. The location of the fifth ring was not a secret in the universe. How could they hide their tracks in such a huge star region? However, it was difficult to approach the fifth ring from the main world. The distance was long, and there was no way to get close secretly. For a domain as powerful as the fifth ring, it was difficult to achieve the effect of a thunderous attack. What they needed to do was to locate the fifth ring in the antimatter space. This was to achieve the effect of a surprise attack. As for when they would counterattack the fifth ring, a small Foundation establishment cultivator like Yuhai had no way of knowing. He probably did not have an exact timetable either. They needed to unite different star regions, be strong enough, and have suffered greatly from the fifth ring. This kind of alliance in the universe could not be solved with just a sentence or a piece of information. It would require at least hundreds of years, or even thousands of years of careful preparation. And he was just a small nail in this plan. He was just doing a good job of locating the fifth ring's antimatter space in the early stages. He might not be the only one doing this, or it might be just Yang Ding. There might be many forces hiding behind him. Then, he would have to wait. Hundreds of years, or even thousands of years, waiting for the day when it all began. And he might not be able to see that day come. But it did not matter. For the peace of the universe's cultivation world, he was willing to do anything. Even if one's status was low, could one ignore the order of the cultivation world just because one's status was low? The floating raft he was on was a very special floating raft. It was made with a secret technique by Yang Ding. Under its ordinary appearance, it had a very special function. It could automatically send the signal characteristics here to the floating raft hidden in the antimatter space at Yang Ding when the raft passed through the transition channel. It could also simultaneously decipher the location information sent out by the fifth ring's signal tower. He was the one who controlled it. This was an honorable mission. Because it used an extremely secretive, mysterious power transmission, he might have a chance to survive. It all depended on his luck. As for luck, he never lacked it. This was because of the existence of the ball of luck in his mind. In the Yang Ding domain, people with luck like him were not a secret. They were known to the higher-ups in a small circle. This mission was related to the mysterious ball of luck in his mind. Furthermore, in order to strengthen his luck, the sect had specially selected a few fellow disciples with the same luck for him to absorb. This was because he was a newcomer who had just formed his Tao foundation. The fifth ring bandits only took newcomers, not the old. Thinking about how his fellow disciples had no hesitation when they offered their luck, and how they faced death with no hesitation, he felt a wave of sadness. Nothing could stop him from completing his mission. Even if he had to pay with his life, he would not hesitate. Chapter 499. How long had he been here? Lu Xiaoyi didn't dare to calculate. It should be almost 50 years, right? He was now 200 years old. If he were to be placed in a sect, those who had yet to form their gold core at his age could only do odd jobs like Gu Bei in the Hall of Duties at the foot of Thousand Grace Peak, or go to the mortal world to blossom and bear fruit. Outstanding combat talent and trash cultivation talent were the characteristics of Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation. In these 50 years, he had contacted Yinyi a few times and rejected his request to go back. The only thing he was curious about was why Yinyi didn't have any other reaction to his rejection. Theoretically speaking, it was very easy for a core formation stage cultivator with real power to take back a disobedient little foundation establishment stage cultivator. All he had to do was to inform a certain perfected cultivator. For a nascent soul stage cultivator to take him away was no more difficult than taking away a chicken. However, Yinyi didn't respond after asking a few times. This made Lu Xiaoyi feel very strange. This wasn't Yinyi's style. Fortunately, no matter what the reason was, he was lucky that he wasn't harassed here. It wasn't easy. His current situation was that everything was ready, and he only lacked the east wind. His cultivation had long been polished to the peak. His spirit was abundant, and his mind was clear. More than 400 stars were vivid in his mind. There were countless times when there was a demonic voice in his heart, telling him to form his core. You will definitely succeed. However, he still resisted this impulse. Although there was no precedent to follow, based on a cultivator's intuition, he knew that if he didn't form his core in the anti-material world, he would definitely fail. This feeling was so strong that he couldn't ignore it. He had waited for almost 50 years, but there was still no fleet from the anti-material world. If it was someone else, they would definitely think, what if there was no fleet in the next few decades? Could it be that he would just stop like this and not try to form his core again, or change to another method? However, Lu Xiaoyi was still unwavering. This was not only a kind of persistence, but also a kind of judgment. The basis of this judgment came from the ball of luck in his mind. It was still as lifeless as it had been for 100 years. If something bad were to happen, then there would definitely be a change in this group of luck. Since there was no change, it meant that his current luck didn't change. There was still a chance. This reverse inference was the driving force behind his persistence. Cultivation required accurate judgment, persistent confidence, and patient waiting, even if this kind of waiting was somewhat awkward, and Lu Xiaoyi was about to die from waiting. One day, Lu Xiaoyi, who was concentrating with his eyes closed, sensed a familiar signal fluctuation. This was the sign of an antimatter floating raft approaching, and he was very familiar with this. He was still meticulously looking for a pattern in the response of the signal. This had already become his homework every time the floating raft appeared on Sandstar. After 50 years of identification, he could already find some kind of substantial pattern in the seemingly chaotic responses. This was not a clear insight into the mechanism, but purely the appearance of facts obtained through countless experiences. 1 or 2, the signal tower's signal was far more chaotic than that of a single raft. Lu Xi knew that this was most likely a small raft fleet. He had experienced this situation far too many times. In fact, when the raiders returned from the depths of the universe, the most common thing was a small raft fleet with less than 5 floating rafts, followed by a single raft, and at the very least, a large fleet. As he continued to identify, his expression gradually became serious. This was not a small raft fleet made up of several floating rafts. From the signal tower's increasingly chaotic responses, he could determine that this was a fleet. He couldn't count how many there were, but there were at least 20 of them. Because every single floating raft was sending out positioning information to the signal tower, and every single one was also receiving information. Amidst all this chaos, it meant a great opportunity for Lu Xiaoyi. Should he continue to wait? What if it was a large fleet of 100 floating rafts that passed through? Lu Xiaoyi's judgment was very clear. There was no window of time for 100 floating rafts to pass through. Even if there was, the large fleet would not pass through all at once. They would also use the current method of 20 or 30 rafts passing through in groups. In other words, this current situation was the best opportunity he could wait for. There would not be any greater luck. After waiting for 50 years, the wheel of fate finally began to turn. Lu Xiaoyi discovered that he was very calm. What was there to be excited about? He came alone, and at worst, he would leave alone again. He had friends who were sad for him, and he also had his own legend left in this bandit's continent. What was there to be dissatisfied about? His movements were swift, and similar scenes had been demonstrated thousands of times in his mind. He quickly replaced the half-full top-grade spirit stones that he had accumulated over the years with the spirit stones that were full of spiritual power in the signal tower's array. The purpose of doing this was to not affect the signal function of the signal tower, but to effectively reduce the signal strength. He had experimented many times. When the signal of the signal tower weakened, the space transition channel would appear closer to the signal tower and to the sand planet. This was a very normal linkage compensation between the antimatter space floating raft and the signal tower. And he, because the space transition channel was closer, he would be able to sense the anti-world star on the other side of the channel more effectively. Since he did not have the ability to fly into the universe and take the initiative to contact the space transition channel, at the very least, he could make this thing closer to him within the scope of his ability. In order to succeed in forming his Azoth core, he had almost used his planning ability to the extreme. He still had more than 2 days' time. The fleet was still some distance away from the breakthrough point. He hoped that this group of guys would fly faster and not dawdle in front of the space transition channel like some people. He once again went through the process that he could consider in his mind, and there was nothing that he missed out on. He sat cross-legged on the ground with his 5 hearts facing the sky. The storage rings were neatly worn on his fingers. On average, there were 2 rings on each finger, and there were also some on his toes for convenient access. He did not lack resources, and he had prepared enough top-grade spirit stones and spirit jades. The sequence of the Big Dipper star scripture had long been memorized in his heart. The reflections of nearly 400 stars had always been in his body, forming a huge star chart. The 7 sword spirits were unusually quiet. They could also feel something, so they no longer used their magic power and divine soul sword chi to knock on the door. Instead, they held hands in a circle, waiting for their master to break through. Their fate was the same as their master's. Lu Xiao was a little regretful. He should have taught them to sing a song. This situation was a little funny. He wanted to tell them that there was actually no need to be so serious. Just do what you need to do. Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, Master and the 7 little sword spirits, a man, and I'm hopeless. At this critical moment, I'm still thinking about these completely irrelevant things. His dantian moved, and the heavenly cycle illumination secret technique was activated. Chapter 500. In Lu Xiao's dantian, the magic power had already become as viscous as a paste. This was a natural phenomenon after reaching the great circle of foundation establishment. The formation of the core, from a physical point of view, was to turn this viscous paste into a solid state. And in this process, there was a chance of obtaining special abilities. For example, if someone formed a lightning core, then they would have a huge bonus on the Tao of Lightning. Forming a 5 elements core, or some special fusion core, would give a bonus on the metal, wood, water, fire, earth, wind, ice, cloud, thunder, and other domains. There was no difference between good and bad attributes, only the question of whether it was suitable or not. In the process of forming the core, one would try to make the Jin Dan as round and pure as possible. Therefore, the grade of the core was not about comparing with others. There was no comparison. The true essence of Taoism was about comparing oneself. It was about whether or not the cultivator could squeeze out all of their potential in the process of forming the core. Those things that appeared on the outside, stored in the heart, and were mysterious in the dark, under the effects of the heavenly cycle illumination technique, Lu Xiaoi could feel that the liquid transcendence energy in his dantian was beginning to emit specks of golden light as it circulated. Like fireflies in the wilderness under the night sky, they were distributed bit by bit. Following the circulation of his cultivation, these scattered specks of golden light began to increase in number, becoming denser and denser, before finally accumulating into a piece. The core had 3 colors: golden light illuminating the world, purple chi enshrouding the world, and colorless myriad. Right now, he was in the first stage of forming the core, golden light illuminating the world. In fact, this was also the final state of the core formation for the majority of cultivators. Jin Dan, of course, everyone's core would go through the golden light illuminating the world stage. It was also the foundation stage, the stage where it was easiest to solidify. The golden light illuminating the world was a kind of affirmation and evaluation of a cultivator's 100 years of cultivation. Lu Xiao's movements were very stable, neither hurried nor impatient. He let the golden light connect into a piece, flowing into a river. Not only was his dantian golden, even the magic power in his meridians and acupoints slowly turned golden. His entire body was illuminated by the golden light, until his dantian was completely formed into a liquid golden ball. This was a very crucial juncture. If a cultivator was dissatisfied with his core formation process, or if there was some kind of unsolvable flaw, then this stage would be the final juncture for him to exit from the core formation process. If he retreated, there would be a next time. If he continued, it would become a road to Mount Hua. It all depended on a cultivator's intuition. Lu Xiaoyu was very satisfied with his progress. The golden color was everywhere. There were no omissions, no stagnation, and no dark spots. This meant that the first step of his progress was very smooth. There were no changes to the chaste ball in his sea of consciousness. He was very confident about the future, therefore, there was no reason to withdraw. He continued to move the body, and in the process, he slowly began to transform his body. This was an irreversible process, which meant that unless the Dan was formed, the magic power of a foundation establishment cultivator would not be able to support such a body transformation. If this step failed, the cultivator would return to the foundation establishment state, but the consumption of the body's functions would be at the level of a gene Dan. This also meant that the cultivator would no longer have the possibility of forming his gold core. The magic power that he had painstakingly cultivated would forever be in the bottomless pit of a gene Dan level body. The final step of the heavenly cycle illumination technique was to stabilize the core, transforming the liquid core into a solid core. This was also the normal path for normal cultivators, but he couldn't do it because he was abnormal. If he stabilized the core now, he would definitely not be able to stabilize it. Therefore, he began to mobilize the star chart formed by the mysterious existence of 365 stars in his body, resonating with the real stars in the universe. At the same time, the transformation of his body was also carried out in the structure of the purple star body. This process was the process of adding attributes to the ordinary golden light world illumination pill. If everything went smoothly, the basic golden light world illumination pill in his dantian would gradually transform into a star core with dense purple chi. The golden light was slowly fading, and in its place, bits of purple chi began to appear in the flow of magic power in his body. Just like the process of the golden light's appearance, bit by bit, line by line, piece by piece, to Lu Xi, the most difficult part was the balance. He had to endure the immense pain of the transformation of his body. Not only did he have to perfectly control the spreading speed of the purple chi, but he also had to constantly pay attention to the signs of fluctuations from the signal tower. From this, he could determine the time when the fleet would open the space transition channel. The most perfect control was when the purple chi filled his meridians and dantian, and when the space transition channel opened, he could seamlessly connect with the power of the stars in the antimaterial world. This was the key to negating the Dan. In his hundreds of years of cultivation, it was impossible to throw away the stars in the antimaterial world when he formed his Dan. If he threw it away, the Dan could not be fixed. If his time control failed and the fleet appeared too early, his purple chi would not be complete, and he would waste the time of the space transition channel's appearance. The window of time that he had obtained after hundreds of calculations would be wasted in the boring wait. Perhaps there would not be enough time to integrate the stars in the antimaterial world in his dantian. And if the fleet appeared too late, his purple chi would have been completed long ago, and he would not have the confidence to maintain such a state of purple chi. Forming the Dan was a dynamic balance process. It would always move forward, and it was impossible to stop at a certain point and wait indefinitely. In this case, the process required him to form the Dan immediately, and the fleet was late. It was completely like walking on a tightrope. Time flew by quickly, and the purple chi was almost complete. His entire body was emitting purple light from inside to outside, like a big light bulb covered with purple cloth. The signal tower's signal began to be strongly interfered with. This meant that on the antimaterial world side, the fleet was close at hand, and the entire fleet would break through the wall in order in a few moments. So far, Lu Xiaoyi's time control could be said to be perfect. If there were no accidents, and if the fleet's commander did not have nothing better to do than to give a short speech before breaking through the wall, then the time was just right. In the antimaterial world, the fleet was slowly decelerating. This was also the prerequisite for the floating rafts to perform space transition. It was impossible to rush out at full speed. The huge spatial tearing force would tear the floating rafts and the cultivators into pieces. In the lead of the black floating rafts, the Sun God Supreme, Taoist Xia, passed down divine instructions to all the rafts. He controlled the fleet's speed and was ready to give a lecture. Taoist Xia's skills were unparalleled, and he was the backbone of this expedition to Yangding. He was the one in charge, and it was also under his leadership that the expedition to Yangding did not end up in a bloodbath. Superior law meridian practitioners naturally had their own unique aspects when it came to scheming and battling. However, This sun god was amazing, but he had a habit of giving speeches. Now, seeing that the fifth ring was approaching, his hobby was acting up. Of course, he had to give a good lecture to these new Foundation establishment cultivators to show the majesty and bearing of the upper realm. This was his last chance. After the transition to the main world, everyone would go their separate ways. How could the floating rafts controlled by cultivators like the Three Pure Ones or Xian Yuan stop and listen to his nonsense? In all the upper realms, only I have the fifth ring. You little cultivators are born in the wilderness. Chapter 501. Old man, you chatterbox! Sooner or later, you will be killed by your own saliva! Taoist Zia's lecturing voice could be heard everywhere on the 20 or so floating rafts. This was his only hobby. Unfortunately, the entire fleet had been poisoned by him along the way and was immune to it. However, Yuhai was very annoyed because this nonsense would disrupt his rhythm. The floating raft he was on was a special one. It was made by the most powerful sun god in the Yongtop realm. It was said that the technique used came from an existence that was one level higher than the sun god. Tranquil Ocean had complaints about this. Since there was such a powerful person in the Yongtop realm, why didn't he personally guide the coordinates of the fifth ring? He wasn't at a high enough level. Of course, he didn't know that there were taboos in the cultivation world. If you provided a backer, others could provide a backer as well. Furthermore, the backer of the fifth ring realm was very strong. Therefore, he could only use a secret method to pass down a special technique. He had to use the hands of the cultivators below to complete all of this. He didn't give the backer of the fifth ring realm a reason to make a move. From the structure of this floating raft, it was an ordinary antimatter space floating raft. Its function was completed by some mysterious power of fate. This was the reason why Yuhai was sent out. It was because he was a carrier of fate and was born with the key to activating its function. He was just an executor, an insignificant Foundation establishment cultivator. However, before he came, his teacher told him that he didn't have to worry too much about leaks. If he acted boldly, even if the other party was as strong as the sun god, they wouldn't be able to discover his secret. Yuhai didn't know where his teacher's confidence came from, but since he said so, he believed it. As the saying goes, the ignorant are fearless. Moreover, he had already disregarded life and death. His problem was that under the premise of knowing that he was about to break into the main world, he had already sensed through the floating raft's signal that the barrier was about to be broken. The floating raft had automatically started a series of preliminary preparations. These instructions came from the cloud of fate in his mind. It was controlled using a mysterious method that was not within the six senses. Now, it seemed that the other party's sun god didn't realize that a floating raft in the fleet was undergoing subtle and systematic changes. However, the sun god's broken mouth allowed him to indirectly obstruct Yuhai's control. Tranquil Ocean was worried that the changes that had been initiated according to the normal procedure would be exposed due to the prolonged delay. He had already forced himself to a dead end. Without the power of the stars and the anti-material world to supplement, he couldn't fix the dam. You can think of this as a kind of perseverance, or it can be called the extreme of rationality. For Lu Xiaoyi, he would rather believe that the fleet outside suddenly began to break the barrier than believe that the purple gas could succeed by chance. So, even if failure was imminent, he patiently didn't think about the gains and losses, but put his curiosity on the group of Providence that had always been lifeless. When he put all his attention on this group of Providence, he once again found some kind of change that was not within his scope of understanding. After being together for nearly 200 years, although he still didn't completely understand Providence, the most basic thing was that he could still distinguish between good and bad luck. But even now, this group of Providence still couldn't distinguish good from bad. But there was a strange thing, as if in another space, there was another group of providence that was opposite to his providence, attracting each other, influencing each other. As astute as he was, he immediately realized that the other group of providence must have come from a certain person in the fleet in the anti-material world. Maybe it was the Foundation establishment, maybe it was Jean Dan Yuanying. To be able to cross the positive and negative space barrier under such circumstances and still be able to sense each other, it could only be something as high and mighty as destiny. This was his last straw, and he had to grab it no matter what. As for whether or not a Jean Dan Yuanying would come and swallow him, how could he care about that now? Through the influence of the group of providence, the only message that Lu Xiaoyi sent out was, "Come, come, Daddy has candied haws for you to eat." This was a pure communication between two groups of providence, ignoring space and distance, and even powerful supremes couldn't sense it. Ever since the great Tao of destiny in Qingwei heaven collapsed and scattered to the mortal world, all the powerful people's ability to sense providence had been greatly reduced. This was very normal. Without the great Tao of destiny, they also lost the source of the power of destiny, and became dull in this aspect. Chapter 502. P.S. Old Sloth is in pain but happy at the same time. How much did it add? Tranquil Ocean didn't sense that someone was shamelessly influencing him on the other side of the space. The cluster of luck in his mind was still very weak. Even though he had absorbed the luck of others, these things weren't obtained by his own ability. He still couldn't master them and needed a long time. However, this cluster of luck was able to influence him and subtly influence him, making him unknowingly walk in this direction. He couldn't hesitate any longer. Who knew how long that chatter would last? Who knew if his floating raft would be seen as abnormal in the next moment? He had to act immediately. Grand Supreme, don't know about it. Secondly, praise it personally. Secondly, fear it. Secondly, insult it. Those who don't believe it, those who don't. A crooked path is complete, a crooked path is straight, a pit is full, a shabby path is new, a little is more, a lot is confused. Taoist Xia was still talking non-stop when he sensed that one of the floating rafts was abnormal. The other floating rafts were following him at the speed he had lowered, but one of them didn't seem to be slowing down. His senses were extremely sharp. Even though he was talking nonsense, every movement of the entire fleet was within his grasp, including the various signals, the fluctuations of spiritual vigor, the secret and mysterious interactions, and the abnormal changes in the unseen world. None of them could escape his senses. In this universe, there were very few things that could make a cultivator of his realm completely ignorant. As long as it was something within the framework of the innate great Tao, he would be able to respond. It was just a matter of how much. Unless it was a limited number of great Taoists that had collapsed, there were no traces of sabotage, nor were there any signs of a conspiracy. He scanned the controller of that floating raft with his divine sense. It was the Een Soul perfected monarch? What happened? That perfected monarch felt embarrassed, but he still answered truthfully. The temperature of the energy cauldron is too high. It's not obvious during normal flight, but when we reduce the speed, the temperature couldn't go down, and it's not easy to reduce it forcefully. Senior Marshal Brother, you should know that the quality of these anti-space floating rafts is somewhat crude. Taoist Xia was speechless. He was an astute person and understood the essence of the matter with just a few sentences. The anti-space technology of the Yang Top domain was obviously not as powerful as the fifth ring that relied on robbing for a living, but it couldn't be considered crude. It was unlikely that a long-distance flight would destroy the floating raft. The key was operation. The people of the Fifth Ring realm were used to operating the Yang Top realm's floating raft in a way that they were not familiar with. It was very easy for problems to occur. This was not the first time such a situation had occurred on the return journey, so he could not be too harsh on them. The people below were all supreme cultivators. For example, the Een spirit that caused the problem was from Jialan. They were used to fighting, but not everyone was a master craftsman. It was not possible to expect them to fly the floating raft so meticulously. Being able to fly this far was already an impressive feat. If it was a swordsman flying here, they would definitely fall apart halfway through. What could he do? Destroy this floating raft? Even if it was as easy as lifting a finger, these things were already the property of the fifth ring. After flying for so many years, they were about to reach home. How could they be destroyed? He had no choice but to give the order. So you go first and we'll follow. Once we reach the origin world, we'll find a few artifact makers to see how to repair this thing. Jia Lan in spirit agreed without hesitation. The floating raft passed by his companions in front of him. Under the guidance of the origin world's signal tower, they began to open up a transition passage. The energy cauldron boiled again. Powerful kinetic energy was released through the array at the head of the raft. Through some mysterious method, the space in front of the head of the raft fluctuated. Gradually, a space passage began to form. The history of the cultivation realm was also a history of continuous technological advancement. 10,000 years ago, when the floating raft broke through the origin world's barrier, it still required the support of a large barrier-breaking array on the origin world's side. Now, the technology focused all of its barrier-breaking ability on the special anti-space floating raft. The other side only needed to provide a positioning signal. It could be foreseen that in the next 10,000 years, there would be no need for signal towers. Cultivators would only need one raft to fly across the universe. Jia Lan in spirit carefully controlled the floating raft to break through the barrier. He hoped that there would not be any more problems. Although he was not proficient in crafting rafts, controlling a raft to travel across the universe was a necessary ability for every cultivator. Even Yuanin could do it, let alone a true monarch like him. He did not want to make a fool of himself in front of so many people. Therefore, he strictly monitored every single aspect of the floating raft, especially the energy cauldron, the core power output center that was always malfunctioning. However, the basic operating law of luck was that if you hoped that it wouldn't come, you would avoid it and come. It was just like how a certain small building foundation stage cultivator outside wished that the fleet wouldn't dawdle for some inexplicable reason, but the result was, the space passage was finally opened. The floating raft smoothly entered it. It only needed a few dozen breaths to pass through. However, this few dozen breaths required the floating raft to operate at full power and maintain the maximum energy output. This was because the passage between the origin world's barrier and the origin world's barrier appeared to be unobstructed, but in reality, the resistance inside was extremely great. Just as the floating raft was operating at full power and speeding through, Jia Lan Yin's spirit suddenly discovered that the temperature in the energy cauldron had increased abnormally. He was completely unable to react. By the time he realized that something was wrong, the accident had already occurred. The floating raft's power was greatly reduced, and it could only output half of its normal power. This half of the power was barely enough to maintain the space passage, but it was not enough to propel the floating raft forward. Simply put, the floating raft was stuck in the space passage between the origin world's barrier and the origin world's barrier. He was in a dilemma. Others were rats drilling through the bellows, but he was a floating raft drilling through the passage. With such a high probability of an accident, if Taoist Zia had not confirmed that there was no suspicious phenomenon, he would have thought that someone was secretly causing trouble. However, the people on the raft were all Foundation Establishment stage cultivators who had just entered the Foundation Establishment stage a few years ago. How could they have such an ability? There were no coincidences in this world. If you did not discover the real reason, it could only mean that your level was not high enough. When the conspirator was a great world, and a great world with a backer, coincidences were bound to occur. The goal was very simple. By getting the floating raft stuck in such an awkward position, they could buy time to secretly transmit the location of the fifth ring's antimatter space signal back. Originally, this information could be transmitted in an instant. However, in order to avoid the dozens of Supremes in the fifth ring fleet, they could only use the most mysterious method of transmitting luck. This method was safe, but the only problem was that it consumed a lot of time. The transmission of luck was a new topic in the cultivation world. Everyone had their strengths and weaknesses. Although Yang Ding's combat strength was indeed inferior to the fifth ring, it did not mean that they were inferior to the fifth ring in all aspects. Any ancient and inherited cultivation world would always have its own unique aspects. Yang Ding's uniqueness in the path of luck allowed them to use the fragments of luck in the minds of those with luck to a certain extent. It was also because of this application that when the luck was released, a certain person on the other side of the space would be able to sense it first. All of this was fate. Chapter 503. Lu Shui discovered that his hard times were over and the good times were coming. The transition passage opened and the star power of the antimatter space was exposed in front of him. It wasn't far and was within the range of his eyesight. At this time, he was already covered in purple mist and was almost unable to restrain the involuntary process of setting the core. Now that the passage opened, how could he have the leisure to care about how long the passage could be maintained? First, he had to absorb the star power of the antimatter space. This time, the operation of the secret technique was different from the previous hundreds of control. There was only one characteristic, and that was to use all of his strength in order to achieve his goal quickly. The star power of the antimatter space entered his body. As he expected, in the purple mist of his meridians, little dots of colorless emptiness appeared. Finally, these colorless emptiness would connect into lines and pieces. When the entire dantian and meridians became blank, it was time to set the core. The so-called last grade of the 3 grades of core was colorless and myriad. The plan was very beautiful, but it needed time. Before the colorless emptiness was complete, the transition passage couldn't be broken. With regards to the speed of absorbing the star power of the antimatter space, Lu Xiaoyi had an accurate judgment after a dozen breaths. Combined with his previous golden light illuminating the world and purple mist forming process, he helplessly discovered, even if the absorption speed was getting faster and faster, the golden light illuminating the world was laying the foundation, so it was the slowest. The purple mist forming period was far shorter than the golden light period. Following that, it was inevitable that the colorless period would be the shortest. Even so, he would need at least 2 hours. Could there be 2 hours for him to form the core? Of course not. Even if there were a few more fleets like this, it wouldn't take 2 hours. Therefore, in the end, it was all for naught. The patience of waiting, the reality of despair, the appearance of hope, and the destruction once again. Lu Xiaoyi discovered that in this short process of forming the core, he seemed to have tasted all the bitterness and sweetness of a cultivator. If his will was weaker, he might go crazy. But he still didn't care. Then, let me see how far I can go in this final step before I fail. The first floating raft seemed to have pressed the still button after entering the passage. A dozen breaths, 100 breaths, it was motionless. Even Lu Xiaoyi saw the problem within. The heavens were so ruthless. After cutting off his thoughts, they let him see the light of hope again. Could this be the legendary anchoring? What a good place to throw. Things had completely gone out of control. His future was no longer in his own hands. This made him feel very bad. This was the situation that cultivators were most unwilling to face. The only thing he could do was to be himself and leave the rest to fate, if fate still existed. Since it was completely out of his control, he felt much more relaxed. While trying his best to mobilize the power of the anti-space star, he also began to have spare energy to explore the mysterious power of providence. Because he had tampered with the signal tower, the space warp channel was very close to him, so close that he could see it with the naked eye. Lu Xiaoyi was almost certain that the power of destiny was emanating from the floating raft that was stuck in the passage. Furthermore, it had been slowly dispersing without stopping for a moment. After a moment of hesitation, he took action. He used his own cluster of luck to attract the luck emitted by the floating raft. just like what he did every time he killed someone to steal their luck. During the crucial period of core formation, he shouldn't have taken the initiative to provoke others. However, from his point of view, since the person in the raft was purposely releasing his luck, he would rather benefit himself than the universe and void. Furthermore, he was also worried that if the person in the floating raft was really a great cultivator with great luck, would he discover the secret of his luck when he came out? His concealment was effective against cultivators of the same level, but it might not be effective against cultivators of the upper level. Furthermore, he was at the threshold of core formation. He didn't have time to arrange for the sword spirits to help him hide. Whether or not he could successfully form his core was one thing, but the standard of doing things was another. Tranquil Ocean realized that there seemed to be a problem with his plan. According to the instructions of the elder ancestor before he came, although this method of transmitting location information was slower than normal transmission methods, there was still a limit to it. How could it be as slow as it was now, as if the luck would disappear the moment it left his body? After all, his level was too low. He still didn't understand that his luck didn't completely disappear after leaving his body, but a part of it was divided by a sinister fellow. His strength meant that he didn't have many methods to use when he encountered a change, or rather, he didn't have any at all. Other than urging the luck simulation signal tower to send out a signal, he didn't have any other methods. What he was worried about now was that if this dragged on for too long, the great cultivators in the fleet would become suspicious. However, since things had already developed to this point, there was nothing he could do. He could only delay for as long as he could. On the floating raft, a few fifth-ring great cultivators were studying the problem of the energy cauldron. He hoped that the elder ancestors' methods were clever enough to prevent these fifth-ring cultivators from finding a solution for the time being. Taoist Zia calmly looked at the floating raft that was stuck in the space jump channel, deep in thought. It was too coincidental. One couldn't help but feel suspicious. There were some rules to the opening of the space jump channel. For example, once a space jump channel was established, a second one couldn't be established in the surrounding airspace, which could easily cause a chain collapse. Therefore, the main force of the fleet couldn't establish another channel, and there was no need to go around to other airspace to pass through. They could only wait here like idiots. This stuck floating raft couldn't move forward or backward. It could only move after it was repaired with its own power. During this time, it also had to maintain a certain amount of energy output to maintain the space jump channel's unobstructed flow. Otherwise, once the channel collapsed, even a true monarch would be severely injured under the tearing force of the space jump channel's intersection. Although he had a yang spirit cultivation, he couldn't rescue people from the space jump channel. He could only say that this position was truly stuck in his throat, like a fishbone stuck in his throat. If they were at war, he could choose to destroy the floating raft to obtain the conditions to re-establish the channel. But right now, they had won a great victory. They couldn't possibly lose more cultivators when they were already at their doorstep, right? It didn't make sense. There must be something he didn't notice. Although he understood it in his heart, he didn't show it. This was the shrewdness of a cultivator. Remember it, observe it, and be vigilant against it in the long river of time. There would come a day when the secret would come to light. There was also a trace of abnormality in the opening of the channel. That was the star power of the anti-space being poured into the main world through the channel. Taoist Zia might not be able to sense the change in fate because the great Tao of destiny of the 36 innate great Taos of clear sky heavens had already collapsed, and cultivators from the lower realm couldn't borrow its power. However, the power of the stars was the cultivation direction that he was most proficient in, and he was incomparably familiar with it. He only needed to sense it slightly to know that there was a Dharma Meridian cultivator in the opposite main world borrowing the space jump channel to strengthen his own star power system. Maybe it was a supreme person. The only thing he found strange was that if it was a Yuanying realm cultivator, they could have followed the floating raft to the antimaterial space to absorb the power. Why would they have to hide like this? If it was a cultivator below the Yuanying realm, how could they survive in the void of the universe? Chapter 504. A cultivator appeared beside him. Fellow Daosia, I think there's something wrong with this floating raft. Why don't we evacuate the cultivators inside and destroy the raft in the passage? That way, all the tricks won't work, and we'll be at ease. Daoist Zia snorted. He didn't even need to look to know who was talking nonsense. Apart from the man from the sword vein in Xianyuan, who else would come up with such a crude trick? However, he couldn't pretend that he didn't hear it. This swordsman came from Xianyuan, Wen Guangfeng. He was in essence sole true monarch, and although his cultivation was weaker than Daoist Zia's, his combat strength wasn't weak at all. He was also the number one fighter in this expedition to the Sun Peak and one of the most important people in this team. Daoist Zia could ignore other people's words, but this person's words, even if they were nonsense, Daoist Zia had to reply. Fellow Daoist Zia, you don't know. My Law Vane's view on this is to let him do as he pleases. There will always be a day when some clues will be revealed. How can it be flawless forever? If we destroy it now, it will become a mystery with no clues. Where can we find clues? With my current strength as a fifth ring, why should I be afraid of any consequences? Zia was a group of arrogant law fools who didn't know about karma. They were endless, and if they could be eliminated, then they should be eliminated. If they were allowed to take root, sooner or later they would cause great harm. In the end, they would have to spend a lot of effort to wipe their asses. Sword lunatic, law fools, body barbarian, these were the names they called each other. None of them were pleasant or respectful. He also knew that Daoist Zia wouldn't agree to his suggestion. This wasn't his real goal, so he settled for the next best thing. I think we need to set up a Dao realm barrier outside the transition passage to prevent information from leaking out. Zia was very thorough, but there was also a personal motive in this matter. No! The power of Dao realm goes from negative to positive, not from positive to negative. I'm using a secret technique to observe the mysterious direction. It's better to stay still and not move. Fellow Taoist, when it comes to life and death, my Dharma vein is not as good as your sword vein. But when it comes to these unorthodox techniques, it's better to leave them to my Dharma vein. Both of them knew that there was someone in the origin world who was stealing the power of the stars, and there was a high chance that it was someone from the Law lineage. Thus, when they made a mistake, Zia did his best to protect them. This was a daily struggle, and they would never shed all pretense of cordiality. If you saw through it, you could just laugh and stop. If you couldn't see through it, then you couldn't blame anyone else. Now, Taoist Wushang Zia wanted to protect the origin world's Dharma Meridian cultivators. Even if Shizhong saw through it, there was nothing he could do. There had to be a limit to a battle, and it couldn't be endless. Time passed bit by bit as the stuck floating raft tried to save itself. Ancestor Yang Ding's methods were indeed impressive. He had concealed the movements of the energy cauldron to the extreme, causing the few true monarchs on the raft who were not proficient in this technique to be helpless. Everyone was waiting for a change in the strange situation. They knew that this state of the floating raft couldn't be maintained for long. The experienced true monarchs didn't pay attention to the floating raft itself. Instead, they repeatedly observed any movement on this side of the negative space. They had different Dao realms, and they covered almost all directions in the cultivation world. All kinds of mysterious energy waves couldn't escape their senses, except for a few. Another observation was of people. Everyone on the floating raft, including those small foundation establishment cultivators. However, there was nothing abnormal. Everything was unbelievably normal. This made them even more puzzled. Lu Shui decided to increase his plundering of someone's fate energy on the floating raft. This was because he had a feeling that this was a very crucial step. Whether he succeeded in forming his Aurus core or not, to a large extent, it would depend on his fate energy. He originally thought that it was impossible to form the colorless 10,000 in 2 hours. However, an hour had passed, and that floating raft was still stuck there. This made his hopes suddenly become bright again. In this short period of time, it was as if he was riding a roller coaster. If it was someone with weak willpower, they would have been tortured into a lunatic. However, what he had always persevered with was now proven to be correct. At this moment, a cultivator's individual choice was expanded to infinity. Every wrong step meant that close to 200 years of hard work would go down the drain. The flow of the dermic liquid in his body had already become ordinary and blank. The fine radiance wasn't obvious, and only a few strands of purple light occasionally jumped and swam within. What Lu Shi had to deal with now was this last trouble. Because he increased his plundering of fate energy, although he gained quite a lot from the other party's resistance, an extremely small amount of his own fate energy was also brought far away by the other party's fate energy. He could feel that it was at a very distant place. A faint human figure was currently smiling and nodding, expressing his approval. What was going on? This person definitely wasn't the one whose fate energy he plundered. Just by looking at this person's appearance, his realm couldn't be low. He wasn't sure if this person was a certain expert in the fleet, but his intuition told him otherwise. Everything was in a mess. Even though he was quick-witted and limited by his realm, he couldn't figure out what all these things meant when they were put together. He was just a reckless intruder. If it wasn't for the fact that someone on the floating raft took the initiative to disperse his own fate energy, he wouldn't have been able to plunder it. He couldn't understand under what circumstances a person would give away their precious cluster of providence. In the Jiao Pan, remote ocean realized how difficult it was for him to complete this mission. His intuition told him that the situation was completely out of his control. The strange thing was that no one came to find trouble with him. Had he completed the positioning of the fifth ring? He didn't know. He was just a small executor of fate energy. He couldn't understand anything deeper. However, he wouldn't forget his mission, nor would he forget Yang Ding's entrustment. He was about to become a cripple. It wasn't just his fate energy that was about to run out, but his mentality. He would never be able to treat himself as a fifth ring cultivator and cultivate here. His hatred was too deep, so deep that it was no longer suitable for him to cultivate. When he accepted the mission, the ancestor gave him an option, which was to detonate the floating raft at the end. It was up to him to decide whether or not to do so. The advantage was that he could seek justice for Yang Ding. The fifth ring cultivators on the floating raft would definitely die or be injured. The true monarch might be able to escape the tearing force of the positive and negative space with injuries, but it was basically impossible for Yuaning to do so. As for the dozens of Foundation establishment newbies at Yang Ding, no one would consider them. The most important thing was that it could erase all traces, making it impossible for others to trace back. He was starting to worry if he had the chance to self-detonate. If he waited until his fate energy was exhausted before taking action, he was worried that he wouldn't be able to control his own life and death. Using the ancestors' words, when you were in the same place as these bandit leaders, you had to consider the worst possible outcome. When he thought of self-detonating, Dao Xia's eyes focused, and he shouted, "It's him!" Chapter 505. The ability of the Dharma meridians and Yang spirit would be exposed the moment your state of mind changed. Remote Ocean had two goals. One was to successfully transmit the coordinates. This was his primary mission. If he succeeded, he might have the motivation to continue staying under the fifth ring. But now that the teleportation wasn't going smoothly, he had to at least bring a few fifth ring cultivators with him. This was his bottom line. He couldn't go through so much trouble only to end up dying here without accomplishing anything. Now that he was determined to destroy everything, he immediately gave himself away. The observation of a Dharma meridian cultivator was not a joke. They could see through a person's bones. Remote Ocean immediately felt that he could not control his body. Even his Dharma power and spirit could not move a single finger. He knew that he would not be able to escape today, but he did not regret it. Instead, he felt a sense of relief. The psychological pressure of letting a small cultivator who had just formed his Tao foundation to complete such an important mission was unimaginable. He was very happy. He was finally going to be free of all this. What made him proud was that even these true monarch-level bandits couldn't figure out what method he used to control all of this. They could seal his body, Dharma power, and even his spirit and thoughts, but they could not seal his fate. With the secret teachings from Yang Ding, he could control his own fate and do some simple operations. The core control authority of this floating raft was to be controlled by fate. Zia had already sensed that something was wrong. He could feel that although he had controlled this young cultivator, his control was not complete. It was as if he had missed something. He was also a decisive person. He was too indecisive to be the commander of a fleet. "Get out of that floating raft! Everyone! Don't care about those small cultivators!" Zia's clear and cruel order was faithfully carried out. These people were the most experienced battle-type cultivators. They knew very well what kind of situation the young spirit in charge would give such an unreasonable order. Not to mention those small cultivators who were panicking, no one even looked at the treasures piled up in the floating raft. All the fifth-ring cultivators on this floating raft, regardless of whether they were Yuanying or perfected lords, quickly got out of the floating raft and used various methods to fly out of the space tunnel. Because the floating raft was stuck in the middle of the warp tunnel, the cultivators did not gather together. They tacitly split into two groups. One group retreated to the negative space, while the other rushed to the overworld. The long battle had made their actions precise and effective, just like an army. Tranquil Ocean sighed inwardly. A mere foundation establishment had placed his hopes on taking away all the major cultivators on the floating raft with a single explosion. What a naive and childish idea! In fact, he couldn't take any of them away. This was not an ordinary man in the mortal world who would bleed 5 steps out of anger. In the world of cultivation, the upper echelons represented strength, unquestionable strength. The only thing he could take with him were his foundation establishment newbie companions. It was a pity that they were still at a loss, not knowing what had happened. They thought that it was an accident, that the people of the fifth ring were ruthless, but they didn't know that it was their companions who brought them to their deaths. Taoist Zia's sudden decision was meticulous and vicious. "Didn't you want to do something? I'll lock you and your 100 Yang Dingtian companions together. I'd like to see how you're going to fight to the death." He had always wanted to figure out how this little cultivator was able to control the floating raft. Or was he using the same method to spread some kind of information that perfected sovereigns like them couldn't understand? This was what he really wanted to know. As for these little cultivators, these resources, and this floating raft, he didn't care at all. He had 10,000 ways to instantly kill this little cultivator. But he just didn't do it. This was the way of the law meridians. "I'll just watch you and let you do as you please until you reveal all your trump cards." At the last moment of his life, Tranquil Ocean finally saw through the essence of cultivation. All of this, the ancestors had probably seen through it long ago, right? The ancestors' only goal was to destroy him and the floating raft in the transition tunnel, leaving no trace behind. As for the mission, time was long, and there were bound to be other methods. How could they hang on to this plan? In the end, he was just a dispensable person. In a sense, the bandits of the Fifth Ring were no different from the ancestors of the Yang Dingtian sect. If you couldn't reach their level, you would forever be a sacrifice. But he could only sacrifice himself. At least, there was still value in sacrificing himself. He could still do something for his family, friends, and loved ones. If he didn't sacrifice himself, he might not even have this bit of value. Being weak was the original sin. To think that he had imagined this mission to be so sacred. It was just a transaction. In his melancholy, he wanted to die happily and escape from this life's troubles. Why did he have to resolve himself before he died? Wasn't it better to die in a daze? Lu Xiaoyu realized that he didn't have any more time. If he was given another hour, he would definitely be able to complete it. But now, when he felt that the source of luck was suddenly erupting, as if it was venting at the last moment of his life, he knew that there would be an unforeseen event in the transition tunnel. Not to mention an hour, there wouldn't even be half a minute left for him. How many roller coaster rides had he taken this time to form his core? He didn't know. In any case, when everything was hopeless, hope would quietly descend. And when hope increased greatly, failure would immediately appear. There would always be wicked people who wanted to harm him. They wouldn't give him the chance to form his core comfortably. In an instant, he had to make a choice. He couldn't wait and see like before. If he continued to wait and see, he would be waiting for death. The purple liquid in his entire body's meridians had already turned completely white, colorless and without light. Only the large liquid ball in his dantian was left. Between the colorless liquid that was almost solid, there were still 7 strands of purple chi that hadn't been completely refined. These were the 7 strands that required the most time and effort. Lu Xiaoyi had already realized the difficulty of refining these 7 strands of purple chi. This was because they represented the Big Dipper's 7 stars that he had comprehended from the very beginning when he cultivated the Big Dipper scripture. At the moment of life and death, at the moment of success and failure, a novel idea floated into his mind. Since this was the case, why did he have to refine these 7 strands of purple chi? Wasn't it good to keep them? The so-called heavenly Tao was also particular about the evasive one. Why did he have to pursue perfection when he was refining the Jin Dan? Was there perfection in cultivation? The so-called perfection meant solidification. It meant that endless changes had been lost. It meant that there was no evasive one. He didn't want one, he wanted 7. This was instinctive and quick-witted. It was also a choice that he had no choice but to make. Lu Xiaoyi quickly arranged these 7 strands of purple light into the arrangement of the Big Dipper's 7 stars and quickly completed the interaction with the Big Dipper's 7 stars of the main world. Then, he activated the secret technique, core determination. At the same time, a strong explosion suddenly came from the transition tunnel. You're tuning into the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.